Off in the distance, the slender girl wearing the plain attire of a squire saw the smoke rising from a small farm put to the flame by the minions of the usurper Prince John. She was certain it could only be more grief dished out by his tacksmen, trying to squeeze coin and possessions from the working folk of Nottingham town, to be squandered for his dastardly foppery and sinful excesses of the flesh, and countless cups of ale and wine consumed both day and night. With most of the able-bodied men off to the Holy Land to confront the terror of plundering non-believers, the remaining subjects of the true King Richard consisted of mostly young children, females, the elderly and those afflicted with injury or disease and unable to serve in a military role. It was easy pickings for the tacksmen and mercenaries called in from France and the continent. See note 1-1 from Gareth of Nottingham. Rowena had taken charge of her farm folk and moved them with her to the safety of the forested area behind the sacred convent, situated on ancient Druid ruins. She was much attuned to the emotions and hidden feelings of the cloistered nuns. She witnessed their dedicated service to the Lord, and how they often punished their own bodies according to church teachings for the sinful desires of the flesh. The sights and sounds of the good sisters writhing in deprived isolation in their tiny cells at night steeled her against silly flirtations with the opposite sex, and she vowed to stay celibate until her work in protecting the people was complete. At the same time, the sensitive Lady Rowena respected their introspective contrition and penance for their sins, both real and imagined. They did not question her lack of interest in such self-defiling activities and attributed her reluctance to her kindly and good nature. The sun-browned girl with the long flowing black hair was well acquainted with excesses of the flesh all around her, but she still remained with hymen intact, even unto her 18th winter. Rowena had been a farm girl from birth despite her undeniably noble blood. Every year since, on the feast day of the revered Morgana, she had been celebrated for her virginity, and her powers from the ancient gods increased by leaps and bounds. She had been sprinkled with the holy waters of new faith, and ate the fruits and nuts of the greenlands, away from the noise and dirt of the crowded villages and the many prosperous farms. It was more in celebration of the old beliefs rather than the newfound Christianity that was favoured by most. She was a willing participant and in large degree honoured by her selection, year after year, to represent her region in the ceremony of harvest and fertility. Rowena knew she was most likely a devotee of the forest god, because she grew ever closer to her green roots in the forest, while she still wore her rosary in her girdle, and stopped her daily activities at various times to pray for the deliverance of the oppressed farm folk from the ravages of the oppressive regime. The Mother Superior told her, "You are blessed among us, Lady Rowena, not as a daughter of the great Robin Hood, and not as person of noble birth, but because you are a true believer and will follow in the footsteps of service to the Lord and devotion to Morgana into doing the people's business. The spirit world of the forest will protect you at all times. Never despair even in the depths of failure." Rowena was well skilled in the use of the longbow and the slender blade favoured by the French. Often she had used her strength to scale the castle walls with speed and silence. Dressed as a young squire, she moved about the countryside without difficulty, blending into the vast numbers of ignorant and ignored commoners. Ever since her father's unannounced disappearance some years before, the young girl tried her best to be prepared to assist him in his vow to protect the folk of Nottingham from the evil oppressors. The senior nun at the convent helped Rowena disrobe in the quiet of her cell. The beautiful, in her own way, daughter of Robin Hood often used her time at the convent to gather her thoughts and refresh her mind with the reading of the many books gathered from far and wide. The senior nun was only a young woman of about 30 plus 5 years, due to the fact that most of cloistered sisters had succumbed to the dreaded pox the previous year. See note 1-2 from Gareth of Nottingham. The fresh blood in the convent was welcome, but caused the Mother Superior some desire for caution, because the younger nuns were still high-spirited and searching for those pleasures, not related in the least to the service of God. She had been vigorous in her application of discipline on the flanks of the younger members, and secretly derived great satisfaction, viewing their squirming and cries of distress when receiving their just penance. The friendly senior nun was called Sister Carmela, and she constantly atoned for her serious sin of fornication with her own landlord when she was but a young girl of only 18. She deeply regretted the way he had used her both gently and hard, and had made her a submissive slave to his repeated impulsive desires, despite her feelings to the contrary, and burdened her with a heavy load of guilt at her powerlessness to do anything about it. When her mother discovered them together in the barn with stark reality of her looking over her shoulder to the doorway, her guilty look was enough to inform her mother it was time for her to be dispatched to the convent for serious contrition and reflection on the dangers of the road to perdition in order to save her depraved soul. Her pestering landlord was encouraged in future to visit the Hoydens at the pub to give solace to his nocturnal desires. Nothing that Carmela said could dissuade her parents from their God-fearing decision. She had been at the convent now for a full decade, and for the first several years she had been a close aid to Sister Emmanuel. Sister Emmanuel, God rest her soul, had been in the convent as far back as anyone in the region could remember. She was one of the nuns who had been gathered up by the Lord in the visitation of the pox to the region only one short year ago. Sister Emmanuel had disciplined Sister Carmela for her own well-being, and instructed her how to show respect to her calling with the proper show of contrition and true penance. The repentant nun had gotten used to the application of corrections that included mortification of the flesh because it was the way of the clergy from those times even before the commencement of the Holy Crusades. See note 1-3 from Gareth of Nottingham. In some ways, it was far preferable to being humiliated by the landlord because she did not have to contend with the feelings of guilt that kept her from a sound sleep at night. On many long sessions inside the walls of the convent, Sister Carmela perfected the thinking skills of the young girl of noble blood and trained her to be responsive to adapting to new ideas and a different way of thinking about solutions. Some of the other nuns were unable to comprehend the need to think outside the box, and did not quite grasp the meaning of all matter being interacting systems, functioning in the design of the Creator for the greater glory of God. Rowena left the convent early one morning to check on her camp in the forest. Most of her father's workers were hidden away from the minions of the sheriff in the deepest part of the forest. Of course, they now were her followers, along with many others added as more and more farms were seized for non-payment of constantly increasing taxes. The young lads were busy tanning the leather and sharpening the tools. The young girls were weaving the cloth for their clothing and churning the milk into cheese and butter. An old knight with a well-worn axe stood guard at the narrow trail into the safe place and touched his forefinger to his forehead in a salute of recognition when he saw her walk silently through the trees, still dressed in her convent robes. It was old Roland who had told her many tales of a time when monsters walked the land. He was a sturdy fellow in the twilight of his life, grown cautious in his old age. He had always treated her with respect and loyal service. Her camp leader Gawain told her that the two Whitehall sisters, Lucy and Penny, had gone berry-picking at the sun's zenith and were nowhere to be found. It was most unusual for them to be gone such a long time because they were quite industrious and never known to shirk a duty. Rowena gathered up her short blade and handcrafted bow inherited from her beloved father and headed for the deep woods to search for the missing girls. Since the woods were somewhat unexplored in this area, she was loath to shout out their names, choosing instead to listen for any sounds of human activity or unusual marks on the ground or the trees. Even the noise of the animals and the insects gave her clues as to their presence in the immediate area. When she paused to rest, she heard the sound of muted voices still some distance straight ahead. It sounded like a pair of high-pitched female voices under some degree of physical stress. The laughter of deeper voices led her to use caution in approaching the opening in the deep brush. Sure enough, it was two of the sheriff's men devoid of their armour, and with their breeches lowered as if to answer a call of nature. Peering intently, she made out the forms of Lucy and Penny on the ground, cowering in fear like schoolgirls waiting for their punishment. Only this was the forest. These were the sheriff's men, and the girls had done nothing to be punished for. Stringing her bow, she loosed an arrow into the first man's hat, knocking it off his head. When the other turned around, she shot another into his pile of clothing on the ground, pinning his helmet to his shirt. The two girls took advantage of the changed situation to flee into the woods, finding the path back to the safety of the camp. The youngest one, Lucy, was an excellent runner for a girl of 18 summers, and she kept Penny at a brisk pace all the way back to safety. Rowena turned to follow them, but was unlucky enough to step into a hidden rodent hole and spill awkwardly out into the open. The two sheriff's men pounced on her like hawks on their prey. Her face was buried in the fallen leaves, and only her tight breeches and squire boots were sticking up in the silent forest glade. "We got us a good one, Ralph. He looks like a girl with the bloom of the rose still on him." The younger, more excitable one simply commented, "All I know, Alfred, is we had two nice female bunny rabbits to play with, and we lost them because of this do-gooder young lad. I think we need to teach him a lesson." Rowena started to shout out she was a girl, but thought better of it because of the difficult nature of her capture. Perhaps it would be better to be thought of as a he instead of as a she in such an isolated situation. She quickly changed her mind when she heard the older man whisper to the younger one, "Get his breeches down, Alfred. Let's get a peek at his rump." "I got to say, Ralph, his rear end does look kind of prime, almost like a girl's. Are you thinking what I am thinking?" "Yup, this lad will learn a hard lesson for robbing us of our booty. Those girls were ours fair and square." Rowena could see she was in for some rough treatment, and decided to play the part of an outraged young boy being subjected to unfair interference with his natural desires. Actually, she was already planning her escape and hoped they wouldn't discover her pointed dirk inside her boot. It was silent and deadly in close quarters, and she hoped the pair of interlopers would soon get a taste of what they were dishing out to common folk just trying to survive in a world still torn apart by conflict and strife. When the two minions of the sheriff came close to Rowena, she pretended to be frightened and went into a fetal position. They laughed at her show of cowardice, and neither one made the slightest noise when she jabbed them both in the neck with deadly little dirk. They both fell to the grass looking up at the sky in complete puzzlement, wondering where the bee had come from delivering the fatal blow. In a way, she was more than satisfied with the outcome, but still she said a silent prayer for both men, praying that they would repent their sins before they arrived at that final point of judgment that determined their path into all eternity. Her body was sore, but she was able to make it back to the camp quickly. Nobody noticed her serious look of recent stress, because she used every trick to convince them she had suffered no injury, and was happy at freeing the two girls. She hated to lie to her own people, but it was a small price to pay for saving the two hard-working females of her brood. Rowena wanted to share the tale of her subterfuge with the others, but she decided to keep it to herself. Right now, the focus was on the two missing girls recovered safely from the sheriff's men. And tomorrow she would go into Nottingham and get some payback from the sheriff and his nasty men. Note 1-1. King John heard the French might be coming, but he didn't believe they'd want any part of their civil war. He didn't think the villagers would put up a fight, and that he and his army would push right through. But the villagers did at least slow King John's army down, and this was exactly what the core of the rebellion needed. The rebel army took over a castle garrison that was an important location for the protection of England. They built catapults, prepared tar to be poured on the soldiers trying to scale the wall. They forged steel for more swords, they carved more arrows, etc. They were prepared when King John got there. This particular location was the spot King John had to have control of, as it was the supply line for all military operations from London and the Southern Territories. He underestimated the talent that was on the other side of the wall and the military armoury they had. Besides having several military generals participating in the fight, a lot of fighters fought in the Holy War, Great Crusades, so they knew what they were doing. Almost more importantly, they had 3 Knights Templar fighting for the rebellion. These knights grew up in a monastery where, besides religious training, they were also taught to be warriors for the Pope. These 3 knights might not seem like enough to make a big difference, but they were instrumental in logistics, military tactics, training, and of course their specialty, fighting. King John's army and Danish mercenaries made several attempts to break into the garrison, but they ended up capturing only part of it, but couldn't break into the other side where the remaining fighters were poised to take them on again. King John was furious that the battle had gone on so long, but he was willing to wait for the people in the garrison to starve to death or surrender. Surrendering wasn't a good option, as King John had a technique he liked to use where the hands and feet were cut off the victim, and then hung, and these people were aware of it. King John didn't get the chance to starve the rebels out, as over the hill came the French army just in time to save the people in the garrison and villagers throughout the country. They ran King John off and continued to help the rebellion, civil war, until it was officially over. King John didn't fare well as he died of dysentery on his way back to his castle, and King Henry III took over as king up until France claimed the crown. England and France went back and forth like this for decades, extracted from 2-minute Read Knowledge Seeker database. Note 1 to 2. Diseases were very common throughout the medieval period, mainly due to lack of proper diet and poor hygiene. Some of the most common diseases were dysentery, cholera, typhoid fever, chickenpox, measles, and black plague. People mostly caught diseases because they had very small houses and had to sleep in rooms with sheep, cows, and horses. These animals were a common source of fleas and hence diseases, as poor people couldn't afford to take a bath and wash their clothes more frequently. The Black Death of the 14th century, in which millions of people died, was caused by rat-carried fleas living on the black rats that bit people living in medieval times. White rodents also moved freely from house to house carrying dangerous diseases with them, extracted from medieval diseases. Note 1 to 3. Flagellation is a term that is derived from the Latin flagellar, meaning to whip. It was a common practice amongst the more dedicated Christian religious in medieval times. Other religions that used the practice were the secretive cult of Isis, the Dionysian cult of Greek culture, and even in ancient Rome, the eunuch priests of the Phrygian goddess Cybele, called the Galli, flogged themselves until they bled during the annual festival known as Dies Sanguinis, or Day of Blood. Females in ancient Rome were also flogged during the Roman Lupercalia to ensure fertility. In particular, as in the example of the Benedictine monk Peter Damian during the 11th century, flagellation became a form of penance in the Catholic Church and its monastic orders. The 11th century zealot Dominicus Loricatus repeated the entire Psalter 20 times in 1 week. He would accompany each psalm with 100 lash strokes to his back. The practice was displayed by the religious flagellants by demonstrating the impressive self-mortification in the centre of the city or village or other public places to confirm their sense of piety. In addition to the flagellation, the rituals were built around processions, hymns, distinct ritualistic gestures, uniforms, and discipline. One of the rituals involved the practice when singing a hymn and reaching a part about the Passion of the Christ. One must drop to the ground, no matter how dirty or painful the area might be. During that period, the pious person was not supposed to move no matter how dirty or painful the position incurred. She could smell the unmistakable odours of Nottingham, long before the edge of the city came into her view. It was so much nicer to be camped out in the pristine forest, away from such reminders of congested humanity. The wood fires in the numerous huts and shacks that were outside the walls of the city laid a haze of low-hanging thickness that irritated the nostrils and made it difficult to even see the sun on high. See note 2 to 1. Dressed in the garb of a humble squire, Rowena attracted no attention from the common folk around her. They were more interested in their own little worlds, scratching and scrabbling to meet the necessities of living. Life was hard for commoners under the rule of Prince John. He considered them the scum of the earth because of their ignorant ways and lack of any claim to noble birth. Yet they served to furnish him the taxes he relied on to run the excesses of his corrupt court. She was beginning to regret her risky decision to enter into the lair of the notorious sheriff. Just then, a comely girl standing outside a tavern spoke to her with a wheedling voice that reminded her of the hawkers selling their wares at the annual fair to celebrate the harvest. "Come on inside, young sir. Our ale is the best in Nottingham, and I will serve it to you with a boon for your pleasure." The girl reached between Rowena's legs and became confused when she came up with no success in reaching her intended objective. "Pardon me, sir, I mean miss, I meant no harm." Rowena was sorely put out by the accidental discovery of her secret by the tavern girl. Still, she had to laugh because it was to be expected from the less than ladylike city girls with their petulant ways and flirtatious laughter. The girl told her she was called Doxy because of her skills in the recruitment of customers for the pub. Despite her occupation, the young attractive female appeared to be quite intelligent, and Rowena decided to join her inside the tavern for a quick drink and to gather some information needed to make her mission a success. They sat close together in a darkened corner, and Rowena was happy with the girls' conversation and much in concert with the scent and touch of the pretty tavern girl. Her experiences at the convent with the sex-deprived sisters gave her considerable insight into the needs and desires of females, more at ease with their own sex than in the company of rough men. Doxy saw the tavern owner looking their way and whispered to Rowena, "Young miss, I must give you a most visible bus to deter my contract owner from unwanted interference. The owner will get suspicious if I do not treat you like I would any other male customer. I hope my tongue will not offend you." The touch of the pretty girl's pointed tongue on her lips made her slap the table with her hand, trying to express her intense pleasure. The men at the bar laughed at the young lad's arousal and jested about the possible inadequacy of his masculine equipment. It was just a charade, but the lovely, comfortable feeling Rowena experienced was no charade. The girl took Rowena to her tiny sleeping compartment above the tavern and told her she was welcome to stay at no expense. It was perfect for Rowena's plans, and she accepted gratefully. Doxy was happier than she had been in a long time. She was fair exasperated at the coarse manners of the male clients, and the feel of Rowena's soft skin made her tremble like a schoolgirl at her first dance. They hugged and parted to allow Rowena to enter into the gates of the sheriff's domain, to gain intelligence about his strength and likely plans invade her space in the forest. Rowena sat on a barrel just outside the sheriff's jail. She had seen several of the folk under the protection of Robin Hood, incarcerated with little hope and filled with overwhelming despair. A couple of them recognized her, and a flash of spirit returned to their faces. Of course, they realized that there was not much she could do by herself to free them from their incarceration. Still, the dormant seeds of hope gathered strength once again. She saw that the jailers were restless with their jobs and often wandered away from their duties to soak up ale in the nearby tavern. It was obvious that they were totally bored with their duties and were impatient to be away from the jail for their own pleasures. Rowena struck up conversation with one of the younger jailers and convinced him to share her flask of wine in the alley behind the jail. He was much enthused by the prospect and bragged to his newfound friend about his military hardships all the way to the back of the narrow opening. Thankfully, he was so involved with his bragging and swigging that he did not feel Rowena lean against him and steal the jail keys from his belt. He strutted off with ego intact and unknowingly minus the jail keys. That very night, when the two night jailers were sporting the friendly girls in the tavern, Rowena and Doxy gathered up the jailed folk from Locksley Manor, and they all got on a wagon under a load of loose hay for concealment. When they had gone a short distance outside the city, they all made for the cover of the nearby woods and navigated through the dense brush back to forest behind the convent. It was decided that Doxy would go with Rowena to the forest camp, because she would be in danger back near the city. They all made their way single file, following Rowena and her sure path through the tangled brush under the light of the full moon. When the jailbreak was discovered, the sheriff was outraged. He formed a band of mean-spirited mercenaries to scour the countryside for the missing miscreants. They were so annoyed at their lack of success that they burned 2 farms to the ground and confiscated the domestic animals for payment of so-called back taxes. Safely back in the forest, Rowena and Doxy celebrated by drinking the sheriff's wine and telling outrageous stories all through the night. The next day, Rowena took Doxy to the convent and told the incredulous girl that she would find the place would be exactly what she needed to regain her equilibrium. Rowena promised her that whenever she wanted, she could return to her forest camp and stay under her protection as long as she wanted. Sister Carmela was happy with the addition of the pretty young Doxy to their midst. Finally, she had someone to train, and the prospect made her quiver with excitement. Rowena took 2 of her best archers with her to the small village not far from the forest. She wanted to get news of the search and any other information about the location of the sheriff's men. The presence of 3 strangers in the alehouse did not go unnoticed. The females in service to the tavern made advances to the 2 older men with much success. Rowena nodded her head in assent when they requested permission to repair to a more private place to conduct a private conversation. They had scant opportunity to do so in the isolation of the forest camp, without rumours running rampant about their every move. An older couple of some import was feasting on the excellent roast reputed to be the best in the region. The gentleman was obviously tired because his eyelids kept falling despite his concerted effort to keep them open. The woman, who was most likely not his wife, kept looking over at Rowena with a certain glint in her eye. When the man was helped up the stairs by a couple of serving men, the lady remained behind and ordered another glass of wine. "Young man, are you a native of this manor?" Rowena lowered her voice a full octave and replied, "Born and raised on yon hillock, your ladyship." The lady moved over to Rowena's booth and sat close beside her. The heat of her thigh was warm on Rowena's legs. Before the attractive older woman could touch her between her legs, Rowena inserted her hand deep under her billowy dress and found her little nest with a puddle of frantic anticipation. She nibbled on the scented lady's ear and neck and slowly moved her hidden hand with studied restraint. The lady's moans brought some ribald laughter from the itinerant farmers at the bar. Not wanting to invite attention, Rowena suggested that they move to the privacy of the room she had already arranged with the innkeeper. As soon as the door closed behind them, the impetuous female fell to her knees to discover her newfound treasure. In order to distract her, Rowena pushed her to the bed and raised her gown. The sensuous sounds of their kissing did not rouse the drunken man on the bed, and it served to make the woman toss her head like a wild bucking pony, and her hair went helter-skelter all about in every direction. After scores of kisses and much hugging, the lady, who admitted to the name of Roseanne D. Winter, pestered Rowena to lower her trousers. Feigning indifference, Roseanne pulled the submissive female over her knees and started to give her a smart correction to her generously sized flanks. The indignant female squirmed and wiggled to get free, but Rowena was too strong for her. When she stopped struggling and started to moan in pleasure, Rowena confirmed her suspicion that the sensual Roseanne loved such rough treatment. Right at that moment the door opened, and the lady's true husband strode into the room with a glaring look in his eyes. "You slut! The moment my back is turned, you are jumping in bed for a slap and tickle with the first male that comes along." Roseanne was crying, but it was unclear if it was from the spanking or from being caught in the act by Sir Roger, her longtime spouse and mentor. Rowena was concerned the cuckolded nobleman might make a scene of the evening's activities. She was further incensed to hear the sinful wife declare, "Sir Roger, this craven miscreant dared to insult my dignity by paddling my bottom. I insist you do the same to him, only much harder." Caught unaware, Rowena found the Lady Roseanne had locked her legs around her neck and seized her arms away from any thought of defence. The enraged nobleman lifted Rowena's legs in his strong arms and pulled her trousers down to expose her pink-tinged bottom. Not yet suspecting he was manhandling a woman, the gentleman prodded her with his bulldog-knobbed cane, making sounds like a nasty dog looking for a fight. Rowena was mortified and struggled to make her backside less defenceless against the falling cane. It was to no avail. After the very first stripe, Rowena surrendered to the moment and struggled no longer. The remaining 9 were equally as stressful, but she found her treatment was strangely comforting, and she hoped the gentleman might continue in the same vein. Still, the danger was all around, and she only wanted to get out of the situation without the discovery she was actually female in gender. With her gender still undiscovered, Rowena lay face down across the bed with her bare bottom sticking up in the air. The gentleman continued his posterior correction with his heavy hands, and before long Rowena was begging for respite. Lady Roseanne was applauding from the head of the bed, and she encouraged her spouse to give it to the little beggar good. Roseanne did not want to be out of the tableau, so she lifted Rowena's head and slapped both cheeks, pretending that she was offended by her presence. Rowena moved her head left and right and up and down, hoping to escape the frenzied female putting on a show for her spouse. Sir Roger accelerated his pounding of Rowena's posterior, and the slapping of her cheeks transported her into a well-disguised release that filled her with guilt for her sinful thoughts. "By gad, this fellow is in the spirit of the moment, my dear. Odds bodkins, but he is better at this than you." Lady Roseanne flounced out of the room in a huff, and Sir Roger followed her whilst trying to repair his error in communication. Note 2-1. Smog-like conditions in crowded urban areas were a problem even in medieval times, due to the congested living spaces and poor fuels for the cooking fires and heating fires needed to survive. Most of the larger cities were located in smog-prone basins that allowed the pollution to accumulate and aggravate the sickly populace. When Rowena went back to the safety of the forest after her sojourn with the randy gentleman and his paramour, she found Doxy had already moved back into the camp. In her very own words, "The convent life is not for me, and that is a fact. Those nuns can really get on one's nerves, let me tell you." Roxana's spies from Nottingham were waiting for her, and they told her, "The tax collectors from Prince John are squeezing the sheriff for more treasure. They are fanning out this very morning to drain the villages of every last copper hidden away. Some of the Locksley folk are trekking in this direction to avoid the taxmen." Rowena was disturbed by the troubling news, but she was not yet ready to push the panic button. She gathered the elite warriors of the outlaw band and told them, "We will set up an ambush on the taxmen after they finish their dirty work. That way, we can teach them a lesson and recover the stolen funds as well." She hesitated to take Roland, the aging knight, with her on the mission to recover the people's money. It was not because of his advancing years, but because he was an old-school warrior who never allowed his enemies to escape the wrath of his axe. She cautioned him that they were more interested in recovering the money stolen from the villagers than in seeking retribution from the taxmen sent by Prince John. He nodded his head in agreement and told her, "I smell the musk of copulation all about you, mistress. You need to go to the river and bathe away the scent of whoever caused your juices to flow so pungently." Rowena had to smile. It was certainly a roundabout way of telling her she smelled bad. No, the old axeman was quite correct. She immediately took fresh attire from the closet and headed to the quiet, smooth-running river to the rear of the encampment. She stacked the dirty clothes next to the clean set and waded into the tingling water. The bit of soap in her fist was more than enough to refresh her skin to its normal, immaculate condition. Just before she started to rise out of the swirling river waters, she spied the old knight squatting silently nearby with his axe at the ready in case they had unwelcome visitors. "Thank you for guarding me, Sir Knight. I hope I am of more scented appeal to you now." "You would appeal to me even if you were covered in the river mud, my lady. It has been a sizable passage of time since I have bedded a female of your good looks and fair nature." Rowena rose up out of the water and bent over the stacks of clothing. She was in no hurry to dress, and allowed the older knight to view her disrobed figure, both fore and aft, in her indisputable sparkling cleanliness. She watched the knight rise up from his haunches and shed his jerkin and leggings. He was impressively well hung low between his legs, and she peeked in amazement with widening eyes and open mouth. "La, Sir Knight, you are possessed with a magnificent figure. I bet you took many a maiden for long rides with much delight." The old knight was a man of few words. He kissed Rowena's with the passion of a much younger man, and explored her lips with the skill and experience of a man in his later years. Rowena gasped loudly when the knight's manhood touched her bare skin gently like a timid stranger. He aroused her with much expertise, and she reacted with the hunger of long denial and nights of lonely solitude. When he started to spank her flanks with his firm hands, she made no objection because it was her major weakness and the key to her submissive nature in matters of great delicacy. The wise old knight stroked her gently and then accelerated his up-close and personal contact until she went into an uncontrollable release that shamed her to her very core. Only his strong arms kept her from falling in a heap on the grass. After Roland had serviced her base needs for masculine adventure, he picked her up in his arms and carried her back into the refreshing river water to cleanse her once again. They dried off on the shoreline and returned to the encampment to ready for the reality of a deadly joust with the taxmen of Prince John. They moved south into the farmland, trying to keep to the available wooded areas. The outlaw band only felt safe in the deep forest, where escape could take many directions. Friar Alphonse went ahead to scout out the route to make certain they were not walking into one of the sheriff's famous ambushes. Several of the curious forest folk recognized them and scooted away, for they knew where Rowena Hood's band roamed. Trouble was soon to follow. Rowena held her bow loosely at her side with a sharply tipped arrow notched and ready. Her quiver was filled with mostly hunting arrows good for all game, including tacksmen. A few of her combustible quarrels were safely wrapped and ready to create either a diversion or chaos. She had formed an entire group of talented females to construct the shafts of deadly purpose. Rowena had a constant fear that they would run out of the arrows and find the sheriff's men surrounding them with evil intent. The band entered a small farmstead, and Rowena heard a ruckus behind the falling-down barn, constructed of previously used materials. She approached cautiously and peered around the corner. The sight of Friar Alphonse's rotund belly engaging in delicate relations behind the skinniest girl she had ever seen in her entire life brought a quick chuckle to Rowena's lips. The devious and often wayward member of the clergy never failed to make her laugh with his silly peccadilloes. He looked guiltily over his shoulder at Rowena and the rest of the band and stammered out a greeting. "Welcome to Farmer Wisefellow's holdings. This is his friendly daughter Rosamunda, willing to offer any traveller comfort on his or her journey." The not quite pretty, but yet not unattractive, Rosamund shook her tiny bottom still occupied under Friar Alphonse's meaty saddle. She was as thin as a rail with the exception of two perfectly formed globes, in a luscious heart-shaped design that comprised her pretty bottom. They bounced quite seductively when being taken from the rear, and Rowena saw a few of her band were interested in ploughing the new territory. While they were preoccupied with their adventures with the farmer's daughter, the old knight pulled Rowena behind the hayrack and mauled her tight-fitting pants. He looked over her shoulder to make sure none of the others headed their way, and proceeded to make her submit to his disrespectful groping from the rear, standing in a puddle of pig slop. It was not the most romantic of moments, but Rowena was not one to fault an opportunity for such satisfying pleasure. Rosmunda's father, Endeavour Wisefellow, informed them that the sheriff's men and the tax collectors had just departed his farm and were now at the farm of Jason Goodnight, an unfortunate farmer with 7 daughters and no sons. The taxmen were not interested in his Rosamunda because of a stated preference for females with a bit of meat on their bones. The daughters of Farmer Goodnight were all of a buxom nature, with acres of curved female flesh to pillow a man's passion. Even the jaded minions of the sheriff were enthused by the prospect of a night at Farmer Goodnight's holdings. Rowena and Roland crept up close to the neighbouring barn. The sounds of rollicking laughter and squeals of feminine joy filled the night air with rich sensuality. They did not have to see the scene to visualise the rolling hips and the rocking motions of serious copulation. Rowena felt an urge to have Roland take advantage of her, but she knew it was totally inappropriate in the dangerous situation. For some reason, the danger heightened her need for immediate coupling, and she chastised herself for such immature weakness so typical of silly females. Roland sniffed the air and divined her arousal, bringing a rare smile to his generally stern face. They returned to the group and decided to move during the dark to the wooded area on the other side of the valley. The tax collectors would have to transit the narrow pass to move into the next fertile farm area with several farms for the picking. It was an ideal spot for an ambush, and the trees would give the band an advantage and the element of surprise. When they set up the ambush site, Rowena made certain they had 2 alternate escape routes, in case the sheriff's men sniffed out the danger. She strapped her waist into a high tree with great field of fire for her deadly arrows. Roland swung down behind her and straddled her hips with his muscular body. She was all tied into the tree branch and unable to move unless she released the bindings. Rowena shuddered with the restrained submission and gave up her inner privacy to the knight's perverted pillage. The branch shook, freeing some browning leaves to flutter to the ground. Friar Alphonse looked up, unable to really see what was happening in the dense tree foliage. He smiled because his dirty mind could easily see with obscene imagination through the dense and dark space and reveal the depraved activity above his head. The sounds of the approaching sheriff's men and tax collectors put the entire band on edge, waiting expectantly for their appearance. They allowed the file to pass halfway through the trap before the archers engaged the armed sentries at the front and at the back of the formation. After that, the remainder of the convoy was easy pickings for the outlaw band. A quick shakedown of the money chests gave them what they wanted, and Rowena allowed them all to return back to the safety of the town, minus the loot and their pack animals. It was a costly lesson, but no shedding of blood to mar the harmony of the day. The band fled quickly back to the forest and melted away into the hidden encampment. The next few days were spent distributing the stolen funds back to the rightful owners in Rowena's much fairer redistribution plan for the people of Nottingham and Sherwood Forest. Rowena was much dedicated to the simple premise of robbing the rich to give to the needy and poor of the region. It might be simplistic to equate the accumulation of wealth to happiness, but it was easy to see that the lack of coin was tantamount to economic ruin and social suicide. She was under the control of a knight who was a bit long in the tooth, and partnered with a cleric of degenerate impulses, but her intent was well-intentioned, and her motive was pure. Sir Roland was becoming much obsessed with the use of her willing flanks, but she didn't mind so long as he wielded his longsword with the same enthusiasm he had evidenced in many campaigns in the Holy Land. Friar Alphonse was doubtless a buggering fool with a yen for skinny-bottomed females, but he was uncommonly generous with his comfort for the destitute and abandoned folk with no hope left for their former happy lifestyles. Her trip to the marketplace was an unsatisfying affair. She did manage to buy a goodly supply of produce, but found no stall with the simple linens and threads that she needed to keep their clothing in good repair. Rowena realised she would have to rely on the gypsy lady in the nearby gypsy camp to do her hemming and sewing until the lack of supplies was sorted out. At least, it was inexpensive, and the old woman even gave free readings from her special deck of cards. The gypsy camp was a dirty business, but most of the transient quarters were a dirty business because of the nature of the residents. When folks had no ties to the land or pride of ownership, they tended to treat all surroundings as convenient dumping grounds for their unwanted junk. She entered the tent of Mysteria, who was reputed to see all and know all, and saw her lounging on the cushions with a long pipe in her mouth, filled with a sweet-smelling concoction. The attractive older woman's eyes were somewhat unfocused, but it didn't deter Rowena, who had seen it all before. The gypsy was smoking the weed of enlightenment and creative spells. She had even experimented with it herself on rare occasions as well. It didn't fill her with much creativity, but she certainly was much more receptive to unladylike impulses. "I see you have brought me your garments for repair, my lady." Rowena stuffed her clothing into the bin the gypsy used to take in the items needing repair. It was a lucrative service the gypsy performed. It kept her and her daughter, with the ugly wart on her face, employed when others went searching for work. The young girl who was referred to as you, even by her own mother, was a mouse of a thing that never lifted her head the entire time Rowena was inside the tent. She scurried over and took the clothes and started sorting them into the separate problems for repair. The mother, Mysteria, broke out a strange deck of cards with graphic drawings on them of startling scenes. She shuffled them with slow and careful skill. Rowena knew it was inevitable that she would have her fortune told, because the canny gypsy woman used the device to learn more about her clients, and schemed to extract more coins from them in any way she could contrive to manipulate them. Rowena was not susceptible to such leverage, but she enjoyed the farce and the deviousness of the foreign female. This time she was surprised to hear the woman begin to talk of Morgana, and the secret cult of which she owed allegiance pledged in ancient rituals. There was no explanation for the woman discovering her secrets other than reading them from the cards, or possibly reading her thoughts. Fortunately, she did not see any danger in the gypsy woman's ranting because her affiliation was well hidden. She almost laughed when the woman alluded to the cleaving to a tall, dark stranger, because it was what every female who entered the tent was led to believe. There were not many tall males running around the forest, and in fact she was taller than most of the men in her band, with the exception of Sir Roland, who was taller than she despite his slight stoop from the accumulation of excessive years. Still, she gave the woman 2 coins for her and her daughter. Hopefully it would put some food in their bellies because they were both looking a little gaunt from lack of good food. She moved away from the encampment and made a straight line for the forest, because she always felt a bit safer with the proximity to tall trees and sheltering brush. Before she was able to abandon the trail completely, she came upon a scene of bloodletting that put her senses on full alert. She nocked an arrow and checked in all directions for ruffians, but saw no movement in the tall grass. The ground was splattered with bloodstains, and even a Severit hand still, holding a dagger honed to a high degree of sharpness, but completely ineffective in its present state. She saw 2 huddled bags of rags in the ditch, and knew instinctively they were victims of the violence that had recently visited this serene little meadow. She only glanced to determine their gender and their status, and confirmed both were male, and they were most likely bandits preying on innocent travellers. She heard a noise behind her and knew immediately that she had fallen into a trap. She lowered her bow, since it would be less than useless in such a scenario. When she turned, she saw a man who towered above her. He was not a ruffian or cutpurse, but a warrior of sorts, because of the leather helmet and the long curved sword in the belt across his shoulders. What was astonishing was the fact that this warrior was of the African persuasion, with dark brown, almost black skin and tattoos of unknown import. Rowena was suddenly aware that this handsome male met the tall, dark stranger criteria fully, but she was still convinced the gypsy woman's spiel was just a coincidence. "My name is Quintana, and I have come here to this land to find the murderer of my village. He is an evil one in the flesh and must be destroyed by my hand." Rowena was impressed with the man's ability to speak English, and she was certainly glad not to be the person this Quintana was seeking. "I am Rowena of Locksley, daughter of Robin Hood. What has happened here?" The man shrugged his big shoulders and replied, "Some thieves looking for easy prey. They have gone to their just reward." She beckoned the man to follow her and headed to the nearby tree line. It would be prudent to stay inside the edge of the forest now that meanders down to the river crossing. The trail is open to villains, and the people who stay on it for too long are foolish indeed. The big man followed her without any words, and she led them to the river crossing. After they crossed the river, they lay down in the tall grass, drinking the water and resting before tackling the steep hill in front of them. The man stretched out and shed his outer garment, revealing dark skin rippling with sweating muscles and more tattoos of strange design. Rowena slowly removed her clothing and walked naked back into the refreshing waters of the water, flowing swiftly down from the surrounding hills. The dirt of the trail and her sweat from the walking in the midday heat all vanished and left her both clean and renewed. The man joined her, and she was impressed with the length of his shaft and fully loaded sacks, swinging like tempting pendulums of promised pleasure between his tightly muscled legs. She ran up into the tall grass and rested her face on her arm, knowing her buttocks were glistening in the sun and still vibrating with the heat of desire, aroused by the sight of such a fine instrument ready to play a tune on her flesh. She was tempted to look behind her, but the feel of the drops of water from his hovering body above her made her raise her hips slightly in open invitation to his taking of her female offering. The weight on her back was overwhelming. She trembled, knowing he had the strength to control and use her in any way he wanted. His long shaft was bouncing like a hard piece of wood on her backside, and she stifled a groan of anticipation. All she wanted at that moment was to feel it sliding into her from behind, going all the way up to her very core, making her his submissive slave forever. She was fearful that she would be seen as too easy a conquest and a bit of a wanton slut. However, her needs were great, and she needed it right now without any delay for nice words or promises that meant little in a world of such danger and insecurity. She knew it was the right thing to do, and she spread her legs wider, hoping he would enter her without any hesitation. Her prayer was answered when she felt him pushing her open, and his discovery of the wetness that betrayed her hunger for instant impalement. Quintana fed her an inch at a time, taking infinite care to not cause her pain. It was bigger than anything she had ever experienced before. It was even bigger than Sir Roland's huge rod. That was something she didn't think possible. It was almost all the way inside her when he bottomed out against her inner wall. Rowena did not want to lose the use of that last 2 inches of prime male flesh, so she wiggled and shifted her hips in different directions until the final 2 inches buried themselves deep inside her greedy void. The muscular foreigner still hadn't begun to pound her and show her who was in charge, and she waited impatiently for his anticipated use of her body. Poor Rowena was so primed for it that at his very first plunge deep inside her, She started to have a series of mini-orgasms that filled her mind with depraved thoughts of the filthy things he could do to her, with that magic wand of masculinity. She was glad there were no witnesses to her shameful behaviour at the side of the river. The big dark-skinned foreigner made her shout out curses she didn't even know she had buried deeply hidden in her mind. She pleaded with him not to stop, but to do it to her harder. He followed her instructions to the letter and rode her like she was a piece of meat given to him for his enjoyment. She could hear him panting as he pounded her like she had never been taken before. This was beyond the depraved fumbling of horny mortals seeking to spill their seeds in fertile wombs, with vigorous but unskilled thrusts of invasive lust like greedy animals in the grasp of passion. Rowena was vibrating with raw emotions, and she moved her body underneath the muscular stranger, with sensuous intent to draw his juices. When she heard him growl with frenzied delight, she knew she was about to get flooded with his creamy deposit. She calmed herself and waited for it, but it still took her by surprise with the first spurt that splashed deep inside like a waterfall from a great height. Her orgasm was fabulous, and she started to weep tears of joy at the fully satisfied feeling. Her usually nimble mind was now in a state of unprecedented submissive giving, with no selfish desire to feed her own depraved needs. It was as if some force greater than the fealty to Morgana had captured her body and made her submissive to the will of an absolute stranger. They did it 2 more times just like that, and then ran back down to the river and cleansed themselves in the healing waters. This time, while still in the swift-running water, the giant of a man bent her forward and probed into her exposed nether regions with his passionate power. It was a stressful stretching, but one that she welcomed with a heart soaring with joy. He was so far inside her now, coupled in the water, that she felt they were one person and not 2 strangers meeting for the first time. It was like they were always one and were together, even when separated by vast distances and circles of time. Her womanhood was throbbing with life, as it should be lived, fully used and fully engaged in the give and take of the opposite sides of humanity. She was the vessel, and he was the caged animal fighting for his freedom deep inside her. They needed each other, and no amount of words or silly posturing would erase the carnal knowledge they had of their intimate physical secrets. She cleansed him with her loving mouth, and he reciprocated by bending to her blushing bush and attending to her until she exploded in resolute joy, like a rosebud blooming after a morning shower. He agreed to accompany her back to her forest hideout and meet with the other members of the happy band, dedicated to transferring the wealth of the rich to the hands of those in need everywhere. It was the beginning of the final push to reform Nottingham back to its earlier glory in happy times long gone by. Rowena was fully aware that Sir Roland was not in the least bit happy about the appearance of the huge tattooed Moor at their camp. He was astute enough to see at a glance that she had been forcefully taken and broken in by the tall, dark stranger, just like the gypsy woman had predicted. In a sense, she regretted her shameful behaviour with the stranger, but in all honesty, the direct young girl had to admit she had it to do all over again. She would do it the exact same way. The good Frere gave her one of those looks that was filled with unspoken accusation, but she let it all run off her conscience like rain off a duck's back. They moved the hidden camp that night, because the incident on the road proved that there were a number of cut purses still roaming the area, preying on travellers with evil intent. There seemed to be an influx of them ever since the crusade had ended, and female travellers were constantly fearful of rape in the woods and alongside the dirt trails that constituted the back roads of travel in perilous times. It had gotten so bad that the travellers on foot often banded together and presented strength of numbers, if not in brute force. Rowena had little fear of rape because she was fully experienced in both blade and staff and could handle almost any situation, unless faced with overwhelming numbers to subdue her and hold her down for the dirty deed. Most of the reported rapes were usually just a single male or a dual partnership of perverted evildoers. It was seldom that an entire gang would victimize a lone female traveller. Still, it was commonplace enough in the Holy Land, and the surviving female pilgrims had many tales of brutality on the road to the holy shrines of Christianity. She had to admit that when the returned pilgrims and nuns repeated the stories around a campfire, it would make her horny and she would rush to find Sir Roland, to gain the succour of his certain passion. Fortunately, Her new friend the Moor was attuned enough to select an unattached female from the camp followers, and the camp dwellers were amused at the sound of her screams of delight wafting back to the fire from the darkness. Rowena had to admit she was a bit jealous, but she was careful not to let Sir Rowland suspect her hidden desires. It would be far too embarrassing to reveal her dalliance with the Moor, because such matters were considered not appropriate for ladies of higher breeding. What was entirely acceptable for the common street females was considered a stain on the reputation of an educated lady, even in times of trouble. The Lady Rowena already had a strike against her for repairing to the forest in grave disobedience to her guardian watchers. She had consorted with the disreputable knight Sir Rowland, who was under suspension for his crimes against humanity in the Holy Land, and her friendship with the defrocked friar was looked askance by the rumour-mongers in the town square. There was even the rumour that he was a fallen-away Knights Templar with so many sins in his past, that any priest with an ounce of common sense would refuse to hear his confession. She was ashamed that she had given the holy man some sampling of her favours on a night that was both cold and lonely, but fortunately, he knew his place and did not pester her for more of the same. Sir Rowland was in fine mettle and worked her body slowly before relinquishing his creamy deposits in the vicinity of her high-born womanhood. It was fine with her because she was most definitely exhausted after the coupling with the mysterious Moor, and had no desire to be tested a second time so soon. The others in the camp were already abed, and she hoped the Moor would be gone in the morning, because she was ashamed to look him in the eye after her dreadful behaviour in the forest. With the early morning's light, a small group of farmers and sheep herders from the higher regions came into their camp and asked for water and some bread. Since they had plenty of both, they shared it with a blessing on all present within hearing distance. The friar was on his clerical high horse quoting psalm and verse, sometimes even accurately, and dispensing indulgences for a single small coin more out of habit than in a concerted effort to scrape money from the travellers. His little wooden crosses, distributed with a little tale of religious piety, were made in the gypsy camp, and they were cheap even though the price was doubled. Rowena had one for her own use, and she found it comforting in times of strife. Lady Rowena collected eggs from the farmer's wife, and prepared breakfast for Sir Rowland, knowing his appetite always turned to food in the morning, unless there was a convenient maiden to consort with under the covers. The tea was hot and flavoured with the honey from the forest hiding place, carefully removed from the searching paws of the harmless bears that roamed with no interference from their human co-residents. She had a sense that everything was slowing down this rainy morning, but knew it was just her mood and not the true case of the actual situation. The gaggle of travellers chattered and washed their bodies in the nearby river, a goodly distance downstream from the camp. The farmers checked their wares and their stock, and the herders counted their sheep to make certain none were missing. There were some signs of wolves in the area, but thus far they had kept their distance from the humans in the forest and on the trail, and had not tried to cull some silly sheep from the herd being taken to market for shearing and sale to local establishments for the sale of meals to travellers. They were willing to pay more than the village folk who could hardly afford an entire animal for their family. It was apparent that the farmers and the other travellers were interested in completing their transactions before the arrival of the sheriff and his tax collectors looking for their share of the transaction. The faster the farm folks moved from place to place, the less tax they had to pay to keep the higher-ups in luxury and their ability to live their lives in style. Lady Rowena was happy that apparently the big Moor had already left the camp and had taken his female companion from the night before with him. She concentrated on sharpening her arrowheads, all carefully carved from animal bone and coming to a point with increased accuracy and usually fatal results. Sir Rowland was tending to a series of small wounds he had received in their last escapade. The poor man's body was a collection of wounds acquired over the passage of time and the dangerous surroundings. Rowena had some of the potion she had concocted to reduce the angry red look of the infected areas and gently applied the remainder to the entire area of his skin. They sometimes moved fast and rough in the forest, and it would be better to take care of such matters instead of leaving them to God's will, and ignoring them like the friar often emphasised as the true path to salvation, with his superficial, hypocritical benevolence. They watched the travellers all move with steady intent like a string of ants heading into the crossroads market. It was strange that they were so silent, but they had nothing to talk about, and no news to deliver. The absence of young ones was one of the reasons for the lack of chatter. But it wasn't that factor alone. It was a pervading sense of impending doom and general uneasiness, like a shroud of discontent that filled the air around them. Rowena scoured the thick clumps of trees all around them and saw no danger. The three of them moved in the opposite direction because they had business with Jeremy, the metal worker, who had promised completion of repairs to Sir Rowland's armour post-haste. His defensive shell had suffered some damage at the river crossing when they were surprised by a pack of bandits searching for easy pickings. They had considered a female, an old man and a friar, as weak links in the food chain and simple victims to be used as desired. There were a half-dozen of them, and only the youngest one managed to hobble away missing parts of his limbs. That was the reason for Sir Rowland's armour plate needing repair, and why they had taken up temporary residence at the forest camp. Hopefully, Master Jeremy's promise would be as true as his skillful methods with all metals in need of repair. The sound of racing hooves prompted them all to head for the brush in hiding, and they watched a contingent of the sheriff's tax collectors ride by in haste, trying their best to arrive at the market and get their share of the cash. Sir Rowland was fair shaking with palsy because he wanted to smite them with a vengeance. He had been sorely put upon by these same fellows the previous summer, when his young daughter was taken into bondage, never to be seen again. Lady Rowena heard a rustling in the brush nearby, and cautioned her companions to pause before returning to the trail. Sure enough, an entourage of several females emerged from hiding and smoothed their garments before resuming their journey in the same direction as the trio of authority evaders, moving to consult the skilled metalworker, Master Jeremy. Rowena noticed right away that the older mature female in the centre of the group was high-born from the way the others doted on her and swarmed like a little flock of geese to ensure her comfort. She seemed particularly strong-featured with high cheekbones and a pointed chin of proud and haughty beauty. It was a face of determination and resolve, and signified a female not to be trifled with unless one wanted trouble. It seemed uncommon strange that the group of females had no male or military escort, because there was always a chance of bandits and rapists in these woods, due to the ineffectual methods of the sheriff, who was more interested in tax collecting than in actually enforcing the law against criminal offenders. They caught up with the females, who numbered no less than 8 in a small clearing under the early morning sun. Rowena could see the fear reflected in the eyes of the women, and she understood it because any males met in the forest could be interested in taking advantage of females regardless of their status and royal lineage. Sometimes it was easier to take the purse of a female than a male, because they usually were unable to physically defend themselves even if their maidenhood or lives depended on it. That was a status that Rowena had avoided at all costs, making sure she was well versed in both blade and bow, and she made a special effort to stay ready to defend against any attack. Most of the females were quite young and were obviously in service to the slender older woman with the hidden tresses and regal face. They were a bit excited upon seeing the trio of rough-looking characters watching them from the brush, but took heart, realizing that one of them was a female just like them, and another was a religious person dressed in clerical robes. Even Sir Rowland was not a source of concerned fear, because he was under the colours of his knighthood and seemed more civilised than most. They graciously offered Lady Rowena and her companions some of their water from skin flasks of superior design. No less than 3 of the simpering young maids were circling poor Sir Rowland, easing him into a reclining position on the carpeted grass. Rowena did her best to stifle her laughter, because it was beginning to look like the battered warrior was about to be treated to some deep forest ministrations from some horny young maidens. The friar was holding court with his own little circle of 3 maidens sitting comfortably on a huge boulder that seemed out of place in a setting with no others to be seen in any direction. It must have been cast there by some ancient seismic explosion that threw it in the air, sailing with terrible finality to the present site. One of the girls even went so far as to perch on his oversized leg like a child listening to a parent, despite the fact she looked to be a bit older than Rowena. The Grand Lady of Mystery pushed back her cowl and showed her flowing dark hair that fell far below her shoulders. She asked Lady Rowena her purpose of travel, and Rowena answered truthfully. "We are to Master Jeremy's cottage at the end of the valley and recover Sir Rowland's breastplate armour. He is most upset to be missing the most important part of his defensive garb." The lady was sorely tempted to ask Rowena her own particulars, but restrained her natural curiosity and merely stated, "Your night seems well attended at present. Those girls are most attentive to my needs, but when they see a male of such height and girth, they turn into little bundles of giggles in need for more tickling." The lady looked over at the friar and frowned. "Your religious companion seems unusually attracted to the female form. Has he not taken any vows of chastity with respect to the opposite sex?" Rowena had to laugh because the same thought had wandered through her mind more than once on the road with the oversexed friar. Still, he was a loyal companion, and bore true contrition for his atrocious behaviour in the company of the fair sex. She noticed that the lady was sitting quietly, while the last member of the group slowly combed her long hair with loving sweeps of an expensive jewelled instrument that would be a tempting sight for any robber. The young girl, who was certainly no more than 18, was dressed in a simple tunic that bespoke of no undergarments, and Rowena was positive. She could see the outline of the girl's tiny bush between her legs as clearly as the tiny flecks of green in the tall lady's eyes. "Come sit beside me, girl, and entertain me, while my companions give solace to your knight and your friar. Do you sing, or perhaps have a talent for dance in a rustic way?" It was obvious to Rowena that the lady did not realise her parentage, and that was a comfort of sorts, because it gave her license to act as she so decided. She explained that she was not skilled in such matters, but that she could recite poems of a ribald nature if the lady so desired. In fact, she had learned most of them from the good friar, who was much enthused with the slow pronouncement of the words of naughty intentions. The girl, whose name was Prudence, was anything but prudent as she stopped her combing and began to suckle at the lady's tit, like a child hungry for her sweets. It was startling to Rowena, who was not accustomed to such ways with the simple forest folk. The lady seemed much relaxed with the girl's attentions and lifted her tunic in the back to display a tantalizing show of heart-shaped buttocks that quivered in anticipation of some sort of customary response. When she saw the heavy black leather belt, Rowena knew right away the pampered lady was one of those souls who practiced the art of dispensing rough treatment to their servants. The sound of the belting drove the animals of the forest away from the clearing, but it did not interrupt the activities of the little bands of females around Sir Rowland and the friar. In both cases, one of the more adventurous girls had already cleaved into the object of their focus and was gloriously swaying in carnal bliss. Rowena saw the lady look over at the tableau, and she applied her leather belt with reinvigorated enthusiasm to the flanks of the whimpering Prudence. The lady offered the belt to Rowena, willing to share her victim with her, just to see her reaction to the role of mistress over slave. It was a tempting offer, but Rowena went straight to the application of her sturdy palms to the girl's reddened backside, and enjoyed the touch of her bouncing cheeks and the sound of her little gasps of shock. She really didn't notice when the lady stood behind her bent over form, and placed one of her hands on her rump, and the other to cover her swinging breast and delicately aroused nipple. 1 minute she was giving it to the servant girl hot and heavy, and the next she was in the lady's web of sexual intrigue. Strangely, the attractive mature woman had her vibrating like a musical instrument. She was easy prey for the other young girl who seized her lips like a stealth invader from below. Rowena was not in the habit of being taken by surprise, but she found that the surprise was well received, and she did nothing to reject her complete surrender. The unexpected festivities in the forest clearing were still sharp in Rowena's mind when she awoke early the next morning. The entire entourage of female companions was still abed, with the young ones all circled around the haughty lady, with her strange ways and thick black belt, for sinful urges of depraved dominance. Sir Rowland was already down at the nearby river washing his bulk with soap left over from the gypsy camp. She spied the friar in a huddled lump attempting to spoon the youngest of the female companions of the great lady. He was not moving, but she suspected his manhood was still fully present in the young girl's carnal territory, and neither of them had any motivation to disengage on the chance their sinful coupling would meet better success with the awakening on that very morrow. Fortunately, she was alone in her resting place with her legs crossed and her blade on her chest, in the eventuality of some nocturnal attack of undetermined origin. Her memory of her behaviour the night before was a bit befuddled, but if her thoughts served her correctly, she had invited the attentions of the great lady in a most unseemly manner, and allowed the pretty young girl with no undies to mount her, in a pretense of masculine authority. It was disgusting, to be sure, but the sensation of the girl's bare flesh was tempting to her confused thinking, and she found her hand wandering down to her secret garden like some obsessed thief, sensing a happy tingle in the offing. She watched Sir Rowland stretch his muscular bulk and dip his impressive manly parts into the cool water of the fast-running river, and wondered if he had enjoyed the evening of pleasure with so many females at his beck and call. It was a crying shame that his age precluded her interest to the extent of actually considering a match of convenience. There was no sign of the sheriff's men, and she gave thanks to God in the heavens above for his benevolence in granting them another night of continued good fortune. She had quietly relieved the lady of her gold bracelet, more out of habit than from any urge to possess the bauble. It was certain to put a gleam in the friar's eye when he felt the weight of the thing in his huge hand. That was the sort of treasure that would give the three of them enough coins to continue their journey, and make some progress in their struggle to preserve the sacred lands of the realm for their rightful king, King Richard. His long absence was now a throbbing and open sore on the pulse of the entire nation. The common folk tended to hold their breath, waiting for the signal that the oppression of the Sheriff of Nottingham and the evil usurper John might be coming to an end with the return of the rightful king from the horrors and sacrifices of the Crusades in a faraway land. They had waited and waited, and now Rowena came full circle to the realization that the king was truly dead, and patience was no longer required. Now the name of the game was survival, even if it meant isolation in the depths of the darkest forest in the realm. The lady's true name was Cordelia of Cornwall, and she had been a reluctant follower of the newly installed King John and his minions scouring the countryside, taxing and robbing the common folk of their coins, their possessions, and in some cases their very existence. Rowena didn't hold that against her because most of the titled personages of the royal court were generous with their smiles and words of loyalty whenever King John was in the neighbourhood, no matter how opposed they were to his oppressive rule when there were no spies to carry a tale back to the authorities. Up to this very moment, Rowena, Sir Rowland and the friar had kept their politics to their own counsel and acted the role of ignorant but happy. Travellers joined together for comradeship and safety in the countrified regions filled with bandits and rogue tax collectors. She wandered down to the stream and watched the naked form of Sir Rowland, exercising with his long sword in the waist-deep water. In a way, she was somewhat disappointed because she had no clear view of his manhood. Of course, she had seen him up close and personal on several nocturnal adventures best left unreported to preserve the remains of her dismally tarnished reputation. The memory of his spirited penetrations made her breathe a bit faster than normal, and she knew early morning was the best time for a quick tingle to start the day off just right. He spied her standing by the bank and moved a bit closer into shallower waters. Now his upright member was standing at full attention and pointed directly at her person like some hound dog on the chase of prey for the dinner table. She knew the depth of her sinful thoughts because it only made her more anxious to join her flesh with the sturdy knight in joyful union, on the bed of soft green grass. Rowena shuddered with anticipation like some wood nymph cavorting with guiltless abandon and total lack of conscience about future consequences. Perhaps this would be the time that the tall, handsome knight would enter her nether regions in sinful pursuit of her much tighter alternate entry. It was too much to hope for in her feminine opinion, because he was fairly one-tracked in his copulatory endeavours, using the standard missionary position to satisfy his partners at all times. Still, it was nice to contemplate at times, when her adventurous backside longed for more action of the carnal category on a cold winter's night. Before Sir Rowland reached the shore, she had shed all of her clothing and took a supine position on the grass with her knees wide open, and her womanhood displayed for his hungry eyes, like breakfast being served à la carte. She knew it lacked any construct of ladylike behaviour, but her needs were upon her and she was in favour of swift conclusion. He stuck his sword in the swaying grass without ceremony and mounted her like he would any balky filly with lust written in her devious eyes and a nervous attitude that needed a firm hand to bring under control. He paused to slap her flanks more than once, and she loved his huge paws bringing her cheeks to a happy shade of red so quickly that she struggled to catch her breath before he plunged down lower and started to stretch a whole lot deeper than the sword had entered the grassy loam beside her head. She looked in his knowing eyes and saw the mirror image of her sinful, lusting reflection, pointing the finger of shame in her direction. Once he started his rhythmic pounding, she fell into a swoon that served to steady her response. Her breathing was sure and steady, and her juices started to flow with unabated joy and happiness. It was not the first time Sir Rowland had mounted her so impetuously, but it was unique because she knew he wanted to give her pleasure, not like the other carefully selected males that seemed to desire only to spurt their essence and move on to the next challenge, before she even had a chance to test their degree of devotion. She had not been very lucky in her choice of male partners, and that was the truth of it. Upon reflection, she had to admit most of that was her own fault because she had such a high level of expectation for her close personal companions and had yet to find one that matched her liking. It came as a complete surprise to the both of them that after he accidentally slipped out of her wet and warm womanly womb, he re-entered her a little further back with carnal intent. Her guiding knees held exceedingly high, and his fully lubricated shaft slid inside her rear door with an instinctive vengeance that inspired him to hump away happily in the much tighter channel. Of course, Rowena knew almost immediately the source of her pleasure because she was much attuned to such activities, keeping her unusual desires to her own counsel. She made no verbal outburst about the accidental switch of entry points, and the frenzied knight pounded away with enthusiastic thrusts until even he realized he was greasing a strange and unfamiliar entryway with all its sinful reputation of abnormal behavior. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, he was already past that point of no return as his boiling brew was travelling at the speed of light down his long, thick, magical wand and beginning to spew with measured floods of cream into her thirsty interior like soothing milk of a carnal whirlwind. It swirled through her tight little ring of anal defence, in pulsating waves of passion, unimpeded by her faux reluctance. She begged Sir Rowland instead. "Leave it in, my lord. Fill me with your warmth and make me your vessel." Unbeknownst to either of them, Lady Cordelia stood a short distance away watching them intently. She was filled with a sense of jealousy unfamiliar to her persona and the respectability of her lofty station. In a way, she had an itch that pressured her to bend over for Sir Rowland's pleasure, regardless of her loss of dignity. But on the other hand, she lusted to taste the sweet honey of Rowena's perfumed pit of passion, and have the beautiful girl pay her fealty with her talented tongue. It was a conflict deep inside her tortured soul, and she knew at some point in her life she would have to decide her road to happiness with thoughtful deliberation, and not at the whim of some urge to achieve a fleeting tingle. Her handmaiden cleared her throat from slightly behind her, and she was momentarily annoyed being caught spying on the tableau at the side of the fast-moving river. The short girl, with almost no breasts to speak of, leaned in close to whisper, "The friar is anointing all the girls with his early morning benediction, my lady, and I fear he might get one or more of them with child because he has such copious stores of holy water to dispense in a most unusual manner." The noblewoman was not amused at the thought because a pregnant servant was practically no use at all when essential work needed to be accomplished. They scurried back to the camp, and the gleeful friar immediately started to mend his ways and started to read from the good book, just to keep up a pretense of early morning services in the isolated location far away from any church or mission. Sir Rowland and Rowena disengaged, and they moved back to the camp with looks of innocence that in all honesty didn't fool a single soul. The scent of sex was stamped on them like a scarlet letter for one and all, and the smirks behind their backs confirmed the general opinion that they had just been copulating like monkeys in the tall grass. Fortunately, Rowena missed the amusement, and she encouraged the friar to join, Sir Rowland and her as they moved deeper into the forest to avoid any chance of meeting the tax collectors of evil King John. The Lady Cordelia and her entourage gathered their possessions and moved off down the beaten trail, in the belief that they would be relatively safe from interference because of the status of the lady's position in the court society, and the fact that she was a recognised noblewoman with relatives all across the realm. Anyone that accosted her or hers would get short shrift at the end of a hangman's loop, and most of the common folk would agree it was the proper solution. Rowena led Sir Rowland and the friar to her cache of supplies inside a small cave, previously used by a bear that had expired due to an accidental fall from a high tree, with a treasure trove of honey in a bee's hive at the very top. It was an ignominious end to a valiant life filled with adventure and countless chance meetings with female bears willing to accept his coupling efforts with only a modicum of resistance and half-hearted use of shielded claws. He was a rogue bear, preferring to stay in solitary existence and not tied down by responsibilities of spouse or noisy little ones to disturb his chain of thought. It was probably for the best because he was a bit of a nasty actor when he didn't get his way, and his reputation about being a troublemaker kept most of the other bears far away for fear of being involved in his many misdeeds. Now, Rowena had sole proprietorship of his former place of hibernation, and she kept it a lot neater and well stocked with provisions and the tools of warfare needed to survive in a hostile environment. She had made an effort to gather as many quarrels of good design to afford her with backup ammunition for any confrontation with the minions of the sheriff or King John. She even had some crossbows filched from forgotten battlefields in the forest, taken from the bodies of fallen soldiers unable to use them anymore. Sometimes their lifeless eyes haunted her dreams, but she knew full well it was either them or her, and she was in no mood to lie down and surrender to such a vicious enemy. Besides, she knew she might be the only hope for a populace that despaired of the loss of Robin Hood. He was long gone under the sod in a hidden location, known only to Rowena and the friar. The friar had said the words of goodbye, sending him to his reward on high for his lifetime of devoted service to the people. He had sacrificed his every possession and all of his lands, and even his life to the cause of freedom, and only his daughter was still at liberty to continue his fight. Providing she remained out of the sheriff's hands deep inside the sheltering forest. They worked all afternoon to build backpacks with the right mix of provisions and weapons to last them until the next point of resupply even deeper in the forest. It was unlikely the sheriff's men were on their trail, because they seldom ventured this deep into the forest without a trail of logistical support and a sure exit in case they were threatened. Meanwhile, the entourage of Lady Cordelia had been ambushed by a troop of bandits that had no loyalty to the crown or even to civilized society. They made lively sport of all the females in her employ and didn't hesitate to use her as well right out in the open next to the campfire, where all could see her naked, thighs wrapped around her captors as they slowly and surely took their turns to sample the fresh female flesh with sinful glee. She regretted leaving the protection of Rowena, Sir Rowland, and the friar, because she was certain their presence would have frightened off these cowardly thieves with their disgusting desires of base animalistic instincts and a total disregard for female dignity. It was indeed fortunate that the path of the trio of forest dwellers led straight by the bandits' hideaway, and seeing the plight of their recent companions, the arrows launched by Rowena quickly caused the bandits to scatter and run in different directions to get away from the uneven slaughter in the terrible place of evil torture. The girls huddled close to their saviours, and even Lady Cordelia clung to Rowena's leather belt, like some servant girl attached to her mistress, in a way suspiciously beyond friendship or loyalty. Rowena promised to escort the noblewoman and her entourage to her castle, and admonished them all to be as quiet as possible in the forest to forestall any other surprises on the way. The travellers finally emerged from the dense forest only a short distance from the castle of Lady Cordelia. The youth of the young females kept their steps light and bouncy, but Sir Rowland and the friar's boots were both dragging in the dust of the road, confirming their accumulating years and lack of exercise. Lady Cordelia was halfway hanging on Rowena's girdle to give her support and balance, although the roadway was now fairly level and free from the dangerous ruts and holes in the forest. Fortunately, the road started to take a downhill angle after a short distance, and they realised they were moving into a long, wide, fertile valley with lush fields cultivated for crops of all description. The smell of smoke was in the air from the chimneys of the many huts and shacks that lined the road on both sides. The common folk could be seen in the distance working diligently in the fields, trying to get the crops ready for the harvest before the rains came to start the new growing cycle. Some half-naked, shoeless urchins ran past them, shouting stilly rhymes unfamiliar to Rowena's ears. It had been a long time since she had played randomly as a child, and even then she was not all that interested in anything that did not have a value or a purpose for the art of survival. They all paused to give the friar a chance to catch his breath sitting on a large, flat-topped rock, and sopping up his perspiration with towels from the old abbey, now shuttered and unoccupied with naught but rodents and bugs. One of Lady Cordelia's girls gave him a long swig from the water flask. He swallowed it completely, but Rowena was certain he would have much preferred some of the imported French wine that tickled his palate. Lady Cordelia leaned over to whisper in Rowena's ear, "Thank you for escorting us to our destination, my dear. We are all indebted to you. Please stay in the castle this night and rest up for the remainder of your journey." Rowena was not overly enthusiastic about losing yet another day on her trip to seek justice for the villagers of her manor. It was easy to see that the increased taxes and the oppression of the sheriff into everyone's life was fast building up to a full-scale revolt, and that blood would be soon flowing faster than the sought-after wine from the hills of France. Shortly after they took to the road again, they came into sight of the extensive land holdings of Lady Cordelia, and their pace became noticeably quicker in the midday haze. A line of happy servants ran out to line both sides of the long driveway to greet the returning mistress, and Rowena was impressed by the sight of their sincerity. The parents of the young girls were ecstatic with joy to have their daughters back safe and sound. The girls might have been battered a bit, but they were none, the worse for wear thanks to the intervention of Rowena and her followers. Friar Alphonse was in fine form, lost in a bevy of females seeking his pious benediction to help them atone for their unspecified sins. Rowena wanted to shout out, "Watch out for him, ladies, he is a randy one and that's a fact." She kept silent more out of pity for his rotund figure that would not attract such attention except for the fact of his sought-after closer connection to the one true God. He used that as his bartering leverage in affairs of the heart, keeping the sinful aspects in the background by constant prayers and reminders of contrition necessary for entrance to heavenly bliss. Rowena pitied his pathetic attempts at romance because she knew him well enough to know he was more of a butterfly of a man moving from female form to female form, pausing only long enough to sample the pollen of their budding beauty. She knew there was no meanness in his construct, and that he was like a bobbing cork in a sea of cupidity treading water to stay afloat and watch out for other dangers. Sir Rowland stood at her side, silent and foreboding, like some figure on a life-size chessboard waiting for her instructions no matter how violent. She liked the comforting sense of safety in his presence, and didn't mind at all when some of the older women felt his bulging muscles, to confirm the fact he was truly real and not a statue. The interior of Lady Cordelia's castle was impressive in Rowena's opinion, because it had a lot more finery and valuable furnishings lacking in her father's modest estate. Of course, the years in the Holy Land and the ravages of constant harassment by the minions of the sheriff in search of expanded tax revenues whittled away the generations-old collection of personal property, all sold by the tax collector without permission of the absentee owner. Rowena was too young to understand the process, and in all honesty, her only concern was the safe return of her only remaining parent from the trials and tribulation of the bloodshed of the sacred sites of Christendom. Now, she was prohibited from even visiting her own home, due to the warrants issued for her capture and sure death by hanging and other assorted indignities whilst in the hands of the enemy. In the good lady's absence, her castle was visited by a trio of Knights Templar, with an entourage of squires and attendants that serviced their every need with dedicated enthusiasm. These special warriors worked exclusively for the Pope and were seldom involved in any affair that lined their pockets with gold, or gave them entrance to exalted female boudoir. They worked diligently raising the funds to free the true King Richard from his captors, and were on the verge of success when news of his death robbed them of their purpose. The vast stores of wealth now reverted to the coffers of the Knights Templar, and they simply invested the funds to expand their holdings and increase their influence with the inner workings of the papal order. With the possible exception of a rogue member, the secretive organisation concentrated on fighting for justice for all Christians oppressed by the forces of evil, and adhered to their vows of poverty and chastity with greater clarity than the most pious of clergy, with little knowledge of the battlefield or the dangers of the non-Christian world. The oldest member of the battle-tested contingent was Sir Gawain. The heavily scarred warrior of Christ was the tallest man that Rowena had ever seen, and she wondered what region of the realm grew men that tall. She suspected he might have Viking blood in his ancestors' lineage, because even the shortest of that fighting horde were decidedly taller than the normal Englishman. She noticed almost immediately that he was missing 2 fingers on his left hand, and it seemed like it only made his 3-finger hand stronger and more flexible than the other hand when wielding a sword or an axe. Even sitting on a wooden bench, he gave the impression of restrained fury waiting for a signal to spring into action. There was no beauty to the man in the slightest, unless once considered the danger that lurked in the corners of his eyes. It was the youngest member of the trio that attracted Rowena's attention. She had to admit it was probably because of his long fair hair, that was more the crowning glory of a maiden's dreams, and the tightly muscled thighs that promised a memorable ride for any nubile female with a willingness to expand her horizons. She had a sudden urge to find a suitable location to wash away the grime of the road, and perhaps even find something more feminine to wear instead of her forest leathers that had the unmistakable scent of campfires and constant motion on the trail. It irritated her that the man barely glanced in her direction. He seemed much more taken with the younger, more flirtatious females of Lady Cordelia's retinue, and made no secret of his attraction with his expanding loins. The old knight Roland looked at her with some degree of amusement in his tired, time-worn eyes that recognised the signs of feminine arousal displayed with a vengeance. He struggled to hide his laughter and pretended to be concentrating on his diary of their travels that he kept with secretive solitude both day and night. His name was stated to be Sir Lawrence of the Lakes region, and he seemed to be overly concerned with the status of his hair and fastidious about his hygiene in an era when such niceties were of little importance in the daily struggle for survival. All Rowena heard for the better part of an hour was the voices of the prattling felines chattering, "Lawrence! Lawrence! Lawrence!" with repetitious subservience like little monkeys with naughty mischief on their minds. She did her best to hide her impatience at the display of female anticipatory submission, hoping that the handsome knight would not fall for their silly tricks to ensnare him into their carnal games. The third member of the band of Knights Templar was darker than the other 2. He was said to have his origins on an island to the south of the Italian peninsula, far away from the papal seat of power in Rome. Rome was still in tatters from the fall of the Roman Empire, and the power of the Pope exceeded any attempt at governmental policy from the Italian state. The island fortress of Sicily was filled with intrigue, and the secret clans with familial responsibilities spawned a breed of fighter that moved silently in the darkness, with cautious steps and well-thought-out movements to achieve success on any battlefield. The dark-skinned Sir Rodrigo had a constant smile on his unassuming face that shielded his devious thoughts from all around him. He took in the sight of Rowena and her 2 companions, Sir Roland and Friar Ambrose, with the perception of a modern-day computer filing them away in his covert databank for use at a later date. He did consider Lady Rowena to be most desirable in a carnal sense, but his vows prevented him from speculating on her availability. And, of course, he gave no indication of his appreciation for her inner beauty, because it would be unacceptable for any Knights Templar true to his vows. He also was astute enough to sense her attraction to the handsome Sir Lawrence, and he was not excited by the prospect of her falling under the sway of the youngest Knights Templar, because he had seen the boy lose his way more than once when smitten with carnal offerings, too tempting to refuse despite his desire to keep his vows. The retinue of the small contingent of Knights Templar numbered slightly less than a score of individuals. They were mostly male, but some were of the female persuasion, without the guise of femininity that would tempt dedicated warriors of Christ from their appointed tasks. Judging from their demeanour, Rowena suspected the females were displaced former nuns similar to her own situation. They all appeared noticeably literate with quills, ink and scrolls forever in their sphere like the knights' accoutrements of warfare ready to hand and part of their persona. Rowena did her best to blend into the background in their presence because she was uncertain with their reaction to the fact that she was a female, difficult to decipher, somewhere in between their nun-like assistants and the giggling girls that fluttered about them with carnal intent written in red letters across their pretty faces. Of the 3 Knights Templar fighters, the most libidinous was Sir Rodrigo. His Sicilian heritage was hot-blooded and rooted in the dust of centuries of religious conformity. He was particularly close to his beautiful mother, a widow of respected standing in the mountainous region of his birth. She was reputed to be both mature in years but tight as a virgin in matters of a carnal nature. It was painful to Sir Rodrigo to think of his beautiful Madonna in such a base manner, and he compensated for his distress by secretly anointing carefully selected older females with his restorative fluids of redemptive creamy formulae in a fully discreet fashion of measured nocturnal bliss. He never boasted of his carnal conquests for the sole reason of pretended chastity, in accordance with his well-intended vows. He had come to the conclusion that his weakness for older women dressed in widow's garb and still possessed of almost virginal tightness was a path designed by God for his spiritual evolvement and a true test of his carnal desires. He seldom spoke to the female receptacles of his heavenly fluids, for fear of being drawn into some sort of conspiracy of concupiscence that would drain his physical form and endanger his soul for all eternity. Rowena had witnessed his systematically sublime seduction of a neighbour of Lady Cordelia, achieved with little effort and scant few words of encouragement to lead her astray. The exercise gave her ample warning of the dangers of falling under the control of the man's demanding passion, and she kept him at arm's length as diplomatically as possible. The poor gentlewoman of stunning beauty and fine figure walked with measured gait up the circular stairs to her appointed bedchamber for removal of her all-black costume and exposure of her milk-white skin. It was as if she was under a trance that robbed her of her free will to resist the advances of the devious but dedicated religious man, with needs of the flesh that required her temporary sacrifice of chaste purity for the greater glory of God in all of his mysterious ways too complicated to comprehend by mere mortals. She opened up for Sir Rodrigo with a little smile of submissiveness and a sense that a refreshing bath would restore her loss of dignity. Rowena looked at Lady Alice with a constrained feeling of pity. In a way, she knew her pity was misplaced, because deep in her heart, she wished that it was her ascending the stairs, to offer up her youthful flesh to the closed fist of God, in a way that would satisfy her physical being, as well as her ingrained moral strength of character, ever willing to sacrifice all in the never-ending journey on the path to redemption. The dark-haired daughter of Robin Hood was kneeling in docile reverie inside the tiny chapel, next to the main gathering room of the castle, when Sir Lawrence strode in with all the pomp and circumstance of a Knights Templar intent on his mission to communicate with God. She huddled under the shield of her forest green hood and tried her best to shrink into a puddle of invisibility in the corner pew made of hand-split oak. She drew her cloak tighter around her shivering body, hoping the handsome knight would not notice her presence in the darkened room. This part of the castle was particularly cold in the hours of darkness, due to lack of any fireplace to warm the chilly winter's air. The adjoining great room was much warmer with its well-tended fire and cheerful light of many candles to illuminate the far corners in every direction. She wanted only to withdraw and silently repair to the room and the comfortable sense of hidden presence in the midst of talkative maidens, all chattering about the visitors of battlefield fame. It was easy to understand Sir Lawrence's desire to be alone in the chapel, to restore his equilibrium in the face of such candid admiration. The temptation to reward one of the pretty little things, thoughts of carnal bliss, with intimate relations, had crossed his usually prayer-filled mind, but he had driven it away from fruition because he feared the damage to his immortal soul. Lawrence glanced at the shrouded shadow in the corner and dismissed her as not worthy of notice when more important things occupied his thoughts. He immediately started to recite his customary litany of prayer and clasped his hands together like just another poor soul, seeking the true path to eternal salvation. Unfortunately, his past transgressions in the midst of battle and the struggle for survival caused him great distress, and he moaned in sincere regret for his often violent aggressions against the infidels, with mean-spirited and sometimes evil intent. He asked forgiveness for his sinful use of the infidel females as a matter of convenience in the sex-starved fields of dangerous existence. Some of them were so draped with fabrics of every description that he had to imagine the curves still hidden from view. The foreign females were mostly submissive for the coins he freely gave, but a few were drawn to the size of his hulking body and the strangeness of otherworld intimacy. In actuality, he was unable to remember a single name or a memorable face, and only the warmth of their enveloping flesh gave him pause before he started his daily prayers. As she slowly sidled away from her solid wooden pew, Sir Lawrence reached out and grabbed her wrist to investigate her form for hidden weapons. It was never inappropriate to check persons in close proximity for such devices. Because he had seen too many good knights dispatched by their own carelessness in such matters, out of a sense of invincibility, that served them poorly at a time when deviousness was uppermost on the minds of their enemies. He felt the sharp tip of her pointed blade in the small of her back, and then his hands fell lower to consider the unexpected sweep of her feminine curves further south, and her secret nesting place for intimate matters, better suited for nocturnal bliss than nights without passion. He was startled to discover her true gender as a result of his defensive tactics to check all dangers close to his person. Rowena looked up into his staring face, confused at the emotions that ran quickly through her inexperienced mind. She knew that her juices were all aboil with the thought of possible coupling with the handsome knight, but she felt instinctively that such a deed would leave her vulnerable to future regret, and her certain loss of dignity, not to mention total lack of mystery, where feminine charms were concerned. "Excuse me, my lady, I had no idea, I assure you." She smiled and dismissed the impulsive actions with a wave of her hand. "No matter, good knight. I understand your caution at a time when many seek your demise merely because of your devotion to the one true king." Of course, they were both aware that their fealty to the cause of King Richard was almost certain to end in tragedy, because the rumours of his imprisonment and demise under torture were rampant at that time, and the minions of the prospective King John were wont to broadcast them at every opportunity. Sir Lawrence had spun her body around so that she now fitted snug against his form in the narrow pew, and she knew sudden panic because her wave of passion was rising fast in her intimate areas. The arousal was entirely against her wishes, but the human spirit often knows no bounds when the temptations of the flesh are close at hand. Her buttocks were encased in the thin leathers of a young doe, and the touch of his manly fingers burned through that slender obstacle like molten lava. Instinctively, the well-endowed knight knew that she was primed for physical contact, but he hesitated because she had not given him the permission he needed to pursue the matter further. "I fear, Sir Knight, that the heat of your passion is fiercer than the heat of battle. Might I implore you for my permission to withdraw from the chapel, to meet my obligations to our hostess, as I am overdue at her table?" The bemused knight turned his knees sideways and she slid out of the pew with practiced ease. Only the hint of her rounded cheeks brushed lightly against his muscular thighs, and he inhaled her scent that reminded him of the green-belted forest and the waterfall that acted as a shower for one and all on a hot summer day. He imagined her dancing in nude splendour with all her feminine secrets open to his concentrated perusal in poses and postures that made him eager to display his masculine prowess in a way that would stay embedded in their memories forever. Quickly, he pushed the sinful thought from his mind inside the holy shrine of piety, right in front of his Redeemer, like some besotted fool hooked on the way of the flesh rather than the way of following Christ for eternal salvation. It had been a close call, but his logic ruled the decision, and his baser instinct was kept tucked away for a time when such matters were more appropriate, and even called for as a duty to the one true God. Rowena returned to her quarters and spent the better part of an hour checking all of her handmade quarrels for correct placement of the tiny bird feathers to guide them on their path to deadly finality. Her arrow points were sharp and ready to bite into the flesh of the enemies of the innocent people struggling to survive in a time of little pity. Of course, the cold-blooded, merciless murderers of her parents received nothing but justice from her eagle eye and steady arm. It was all ordained by the precepts of an eye for an eye, straight out of the Old Testament, with no mistake about the meaning. The urge to even the score with the sheriff's men was driven into her persona, like her skills for milking a cow or churning butter on a cool summer day. She was ready to fight for justice and keep the people under her protection safe from the harassment of the sheriff's men and the greedy followers of the usurper King John. Many of the village children would satisfy their curiosity about the members of the Knight Templar in their midst simply by squatting in the dust or the stones and watching them as they practiced mayhem with either sword or axe. It was at times like that the true nature of their fighting spirit surfaced on their calm and peaceful exteriors. With teeth bared and sharpened blades splitting the air with a song of violent intent, they whirled and stamped about the courtyard, halting all thought of distraction from the spectacular sight. Rowena actually pitied the fate of the deluded followers of an evil god preying on the pilgrims to the Holy Land. Her sense of pity was short-lived because the tales of rape and torture endured by the travellers. To the paths of the Son of God seemed to hit into every village and home inside the realm. Her mother's two sisters had been subjected to unspeakable indignities right out in public, whilst the supposed authorities of the foreign powers laughed at the sight. They even encouraged their subjects to further outrageous displays of inhumane treatment of innocent and defenceless faithful. The pilgrims wanted to follow the sacred route of Christ that ended with his 3 years of public life and the ultimate sacrifice on a Roman cross. They wanted to see the places that witnessed the mystery of the resurrection and quick ascension into the kingdom of God. Those that were robbed of their lives in simple attesting of their faith would certainly be martyred as true believers, shriven of their transgressions by a priest of the church before their final moments in this dimension of existence. Saints, one and all, they were too numerous to enumerate in the canons of the one holy and apostolic church dogma. The most valiant of the populace travelled to the Holy Land for reasons of piety or to defend the faith, and the remainder of the common folk suffered under the brutal authority of a regime too greedy for its own good and under a purported ruler with no sense of loyalty to his own people. Rowena confessed her sinful thoughts about Sir Lawrence to the ancient priest, still assigned to the convent where she had spent so many of her youthful years. It was there that she had learned the intricate conflicts of right and wrong in a world gone crazy, with so many easy paths to instant gratification. The priest was so lost in his own little world of bad hearing, sour stomach and aching knees, to the extent that he only listened with one ear and gave her a modest penance that inconvenienced her, for only a few moments on her knees on the hard wooden pew. She felt it was not enough to compensate for her guilty, heated pleasure, thinking about the handsome, long-haired knight fully in control of her slightest movement, and only inches from her face and eager lips. She remembered with some degree of shame her pitiful whimpers of emotion-laden bliss each time he clove unto her, with masculine certainty forcing her to part the depths of her femininity, like the powerless waves of the Red Sea spread open by the word of God. She took little comfort in the fact that she was still a technical virgin because of the many sinful thoughts and close encounters of the physical kind that she had endured for several years. The fact that she was a willing accomplice in many of these escapades was a source of constant guilt to her convent-trained logic, and her conscience weighed heavily on her mortal soul, causing her to make the silliest of vows to do this or that, or to not do this or that, thinking all she had to do was to promise, and hope her willpower was enough to forestall any fall from grace that would ensure her an eternity in the fires of hell. It was with a sigh of relief that she pushed all such negative thoughts from her constantly optimistic mind, and allowed a smile cross her face when she was seated directly behind Sir Lawrence in the small chapel. He noticed her change of attitude almost immediately, and his mind wandered from his dutiful piety as he focused on the secrets beneath her modest attire. Lady Cordelia was fully aware of the cross-currents of sexual tension sweeping the pews around her. In her own way, she was much attuned to the urges of appetites long suppressed by the fear of eternal damnation and the condemnation of rumour-mongering peers. She had many sins to atone for, but had no intention of curtailing her nocturnal impulses until she was much closer to her final breath. In all honesty, the good lady was much impressed with the handsome Sir Lawrence, and she harboured some dark thoughts about his possible needs for feminine companionship whilst a guest in the privacy of her castle. It was during that season of the year when her disinterested spouse was depleting the nearby forest of abundant game with the help of subordinates and sporting neighbours from near and far. Needless to say, she was in a mood of disappointed boredom, and the tempting Knights Templar was a dish she was wont to turn down. Her crafty mind began to construct a court-styled intrigue that involved the handsome knight, her new friend Rowena, and, of course, she would be right in the middle to sample all the physical pleasures she imagined waiting for her in the secrecy of a darkened room. The mature lady was remarkably well preserved for a female of her years, but the advantage of position and ready cash to pay for her cosmetic needs helped her immensely in maintaining her illusion of beauty. She was all too well aware of the fact that in the middle of the night, in the privacy of a dimly lit room, the reality of female skin exposed for masculine inquisitiveness broached no obstacle to normal cupidity, and seldom raised the hint of a conscience until the following light of day. Poor Sir Lawrence had not the slightest inkling of the plots swirling about him, and he did his best to concentrate on the prayers at hand. The giggling young things that pestered him in other places than the chapel were at bay in the sombre surroundings. Only the chilly beauty of the clear-eyed Rowena and the sultry mystery of his hostess, Lady Cordelia, stayed in close proximity to his person, and he could actually inhale their dual sense of feminine arousal, aided no doubt by the fine potions purchased from foreign lands. In a certain way, they were similar to his highly developed sense of smell, but he noticed one of them had an element of wildness to the odour that he had encountered rarely in his worldly travels. In those instances, he was almost certain it identified a practitioner of the dark arts. In blunt terms, he sensed he was dealing with a witch. Of course, he knew from prior escapades that there were good witches and bad witches, just as there were good and bad people in all walks of life. In point of fact, he had even bedded a witch or two in the course of his many adventures, and was none the worse for wear, despite having to wear an amulet for almost a year after a gypsy with soft lips and even softer hips had tried to put her stamp of ownership on his rump like some rancher, with a honey-flavoured loop of entanglement that required his unenthusiastic obedience to her rules and orders. That was a close one, but he learned his lesson to stay away from the dangerous ones at all costs, because there was always an element of unforeseen consequences that came with the prize. That was enough to strengthen his determination to avoid any danger of up-close and personal contact with the Lady Rowena. He was much attracted to her pleasant attitude and attractive young body, but he knew it would be risky business even in the best of circumstances. Of course, these times were not the best of circumstances, and danger seemed to lurk in every darkened corner. Rowena was petulant with frustration at Sir Lawrence's reluctance to enter into a bond of physical pleasure. She made her feelings obvious to the point of laughter, on the part of the other females in the castle, but he was totally oblivious to her charms. It pained her to see him sporting one of the younger maidens behind the hallway curtains, causing her to pretend ignorance of the knight's impetuous dalliance right out in the open. The poor young lady was surely tagged with a blemished reputation, but she seemed less than concerned whilst the song of budding romance was in the air and actually touching her skin. Rowena was fair glowing green with envy at the situation, and vowed that she would never entertain a single thought about the fickle knight in those terms that might make her susceptible to his charms in the future. It gave her secret comfort to be so adamant about her vowed abstinence from the young knight's circle of willing female companionship. Her good friend, the Lady Cordelia, questioned her reasons for avoiding even a chance conversation with the handsome knight. Her staunchest ally, Sir Rowland, made no effort to remark on her reticence in establishing a friendship with the knight in question. But he took the opportunity of her weakened attitude to make free with his kisses and hugged her close to his strong, albeit much more mature bosom, in a way that was sure to fire up her ardour in matters of the heart. In all honesty, all Rowena had to do was close her pretty eyes and imagine his arms were the arms of Sir Lawrence wrapped around her person, grasping her tightly like some captured pilgrim on the road to Damascus. It never failed to bring a blush to her cheeks and a certain familiar dampness to her privates that she cherished with the clarity of unrequited passion. Her mornings now witnessed her constant target practice behind the castle wall, using the stacks of hay to buffer her sharp arrows, always quick to the mark and certain to be dead centre. Sir Rowland engaged her in swordplay, making certain she was well protected with the full meshed armour from the Holy Land to protect her vital parts and preventing her from any accident that might draw blood when only scrapes and bruises were the maximum danger preferred. Sometimes, when she was particularly remiss in her exercises, he would bring her to the private place in the barn and administer a correction to her flanks like a teacher, instructing his pupil to be more attentive and cautious when her life was at stake, and there was no room for unnecessary mistakes that would result in tragedy. In a strange way, Rowena was mortified at the liberty taken by her mentor, yet at the same time, she delighted in the tingles of pleasure that swept her tiny frame when he delivered his instruction to her belaboured buttocks with his demanding palms. She hid her secret weakness from his recognition, and pretended to be completely contrite and promised to improve her future actions to a degree that would forestall any repetition of the same sort of remedy in the future. Rowena hoped she was able to hide her hidden desire that just the opposite was the case and longed for the familiar stretching over his muscular thighs when she erred like a novice still wet behind the ears. It was the following Sunday in the church, without a leak-proof roof, that she first heard of the supposed demise of the true king. At first it was just rumours and whispers behind close-held hands. But then it became a wave of fear and grief that the inconceivable had actually occurred, and the beloved ruler had succumbed to the isolation and despair of his imprisonment. She had no doubt that his confinement was harsh and devoid of any comfort, and in all honesty, it was far too long for any mortal man to endure without some sort of damage to their human condition. Rowena vowed that she would never allow the sheriff's men to capture her and force her to give up her dignity, and eventually, her spirit of resistance. One of the reasons she kept Sir Rowland always at her side was for him to deliver the fatal blow to sweep her off the chessboard of the warring factions. He was none too pleased at that terrible assignment, but he was loyal to the core, and she had no doubt he would follow orders just as he had done his entire life. Suddenly she realised that now more than ever, she would be required to lead her people against the oppression of the usurper king and to mitigate their suffering as long as breath flowed through her body. The elderly priest was so involved with the familiar rituals of conducting the Mass for the faithful that he closed his mind to the swirling emotions of the parishioners buzzing with distress over the terrible news from the continent. As soon as the Mass drew to the final "Go in peace," she strode down the aisle with Sir Rowland, the sad-faced friar, and the small retinue of 3 Knights Templars to the hidden armoury with their weapons stashed for immediate use. There was little doubt that the minions of the sheriff would be down on their heads before the clock struck noon. The small group of resistance fighters moved into the forest mounted on steeds provided by the good Lady Cordelia in a display of goodwill to their cause. They managed to cover most of the distance at a sharp trot, but had to dismount and lead their horses when the undergrowth grew too dense for mounted progress. The knights took turns in clearing the way with their long swords, and eventually they reached the fast-flowing river that marked the boundary of Rowena's hidden realm. Those in the encampment were delighted with the addition of the trio of Knight Templars to their cause. Rowena knew each of them had their own agendas related more to the never-ending quest for the Holy Grail and safety for Christian travellers in sacred paths in the Holy Land than to personal enrichment or matters of the flesh. She was still in her own way enamoured of the handsomest of the knights, Sir Lawrence, but was circumspect in her behaviour and protective of her reputation in the eventuality that he might possibly find her suitable for marital partnership. Sir Rowland was sensitive of her feelings and accepting of the fact that he was far too advanced in years to be her consort in matters of the heart. Besides, there were plenty of joyful milkmaids with sturdy haunches ready to bring him solace on a cold winter's night. The entire retinue of the visitors from the Holy Land was 25, including smiths and handlers for their mounts, and several squires with varying degrees of fighting skills. One of them was called Patrick the Viking, because he had been captured by the invading hordes from the north when he was but a youngster too small and weak to carry a heavy sword. The Norsemen gave him a captured crossbow taken from the French at some raid on their shoreline several years past. He quickly excelled with the use of the device, and eventually became proficient in constructing arrows that flew straight and true to the mark at much longer distances than most bows of customary design. Patrick was uncertain of his true age, but he related the age suspected by the Vikings to be a single year shy of 20 winters. He was generally silent and only talked of his faraway bride in the frozen land of the Vikings, along with a pair of young ones still barely able to walk on their own 2 feet. His woman was called Ingrid, and she apparently was gifted to him for his exploits in raiding the lands of the warlike Scots, ever ready for a good fight and afraid of no man, especially the raiders from the north. He became good friends with Rowena because they were much attuned to the skills of the bow. He constantly pestered Rowena with the superiority of the crossbow over the longbow, and she merely laughed at his biased opinions born from his reliance on the crossbow and lack of skill with the longbow. Rowena had to admit the crossbow had the advantage of a lower trajectory and generally had explosive velocity at the point of impact. Still, she felt the long bow's range made it more dangerous in the hands of a skilled archer, and she knew even the light armour of mounted warriors would be penetrated by a properly designed shaft. Sometimes she would converse with Patrick even in the dead of night, and they would work on the shafts to to ensure they had sizable inventories in the eventuality of an unexpected raid by the sheriff's men. The Knights Templar fighters were more inclined to use of the sword or the axe, and left the archery to their squires or talented common folk to back up their fighting skills. It was truly a necessity, and not a luxury, to have trained archers with them at all times because of the danger from enemy archers engaging them from a distance with deadly results. Rowena pitied Patrick's sense of loneliness, being so distant from his wife and child, and fell into a routine of massaging his back and shoulders that eventually fell into actual contact with his hardened shaft. It was entirely accidental at first, but then after careful sorting in her mind of the consequences of her actions, Rowena agreed to drain the boy of his pressures in the privacy of her tent and under the promise of complete silence about such matters to protect her reputation. She told him, "Do not expect anything more, Patrick. Just pretend I am your Ingrid, and you are in her grasp the entire time." Patrick was obedient to her terms, and at such times, he would simply raise her hood to cover her face and addressed her as Ingrid to thank her effusively for her gentle ministrations on his behalf. It was a fine solution for Rowena's reputation, and for affirming Patrick's loyalty to his spouse in a far distant land. The connection between Rowena and the young archer went without notice amongst the forest dwellers, with the possible exception of Sir Rowland. The battered, mature knight was conflicted only to the extent that he had entertained thoughts of a twilight union with the much younger and adventurous daughter of Robin Hood. Of course, that was with the full knowledge that she would probably drive him to his grave sooner rather than later. The appearance of the Knights Templar in their midst had momentarily extinguished his ardour in that direction, because the youth and vigour of Sir Lawrence, matched by his handsome exterior, was enough to convince him that Rowena had far better options than a worn-out older knight with aching joints in the cold winter months. Now that she had Sir Rowland, the friar, the trio of Knights Templar, and the skilled crossbow archer at her side, Rowena felt almost invincible when she moved like a silent ghost through the deepest reaches of Sherwood Forest. She made certain that their raids and patrols were conducted some distance from their forest hiding place, because discovery would ultimately lead to either death or eviction with extreme prejudice. The sheriff's men were particularly active on the other side of the river boundary. They were collecting taxes for some sort of celebration that would bring the titled gentry together in Nottingham for affirmation of loyalty to King John. Rowena knew of the gathering storm of common folk and rebellious barons that wanted King John to sign their order of fairness and justice to the governed populace. He had sworn to never put quill to paper because it was the ultimate admission of weakness and wrongdoing. The usurper king had lived a lifetime of pretense, and he had no inclination to admit his guilt in such a public way. They all stayed motionless inside the edge of the forest, watching the prosperous village on the other side of the river burn down to black cinders, as the sheriff's men led the horses, cows and sheep off to the castle for redistribution, to his followers and to his tacksmen for expenses of his luxurious lifestyle. He had claimed the funds were for the tending of the returned crusaders, in need of medical care and proper housing after years in the service of church and country, in the chaos of the war-riddled Holy Land. The vast numbers of men not quite whole and in need of assistance was startling, and he used their needs to spark the fundraising. The wily false king had no intention of ever using any of the money for the wounded veterans, but it made his greed seem less dastardly with the excuse of righteous intentions. Rowena was on her elbows and knees, hidden in the thick brush. The sight of the sheriff's men whipping the widows and young daughters of the fallen fighters that sacrificed their lives for Christ and King was maddening enough to make her fingers shake with a rage that she had great difficulty in containing without some sort of visible expression. Those around her knew well enough to give her a wide berth at such a time, because she could be as explosive as a raging river, swollen with the melting ice of the mountains at the beginning of springtime. When she saw them loading up some of the younger and more attractive daughters into an open cart, intended for gathering hay or bringing farm stock to market for sale, she quickly outlined a plan to waylay the transport and release the maids back to their families, or escape with them to the safety of the deep forest. Fortunately, there were only a half-dozen sheriff's deputies guarding the transfer of pretty young things to a lifetime of labour and loss of dignity inside the castle walls. The very first volley of arrows from the bows of Rowena and her archers eliminated all but one of the guards. The last remaining one ran so fast down the dirt road that even the quarrel from Patrick's crossbow could not catch up with him. The 8 freed young maidens were eternally grateful to their saviour from the forest, and they all elected to repair to the deep woods because their homes were destroyed, and they would likely be recaptured as spoils of war by the sheriff's men, and be given a memorable beating as well. Apparently, Patrick was entranced by the red-haired beauty that shone like a new penny in the dishevelled group that joined them for the trek back into the darkness of the sheltering trees. Rowena was not in the least bit dismayed by his fickle attitude, but she did feel a qualm of pity for his poor wife so far away that she was no competition at all for the fresh young thing with hair down to her waist and slender legs to match. She had no doubt that Patrick would be smiling a great deal the next morning after getting better acquainted with the lovely young thing and her eyes of submissive obedience to his every whisper of suggestion. Their return was met with joy because the addition of so many fresh young female faces lifted the morale of the fighters with little entertainment to drive away their dreams of defeating the minions of the dreaded sheriff, and his free mercenary tax collectors with little pity for the common folk and their harsh existence under a false king. Sir Rowland made an inquiry of her mood for some evening sport, but Rowena waved him away with her hand because she was already plotting their next move, to rid themselves of the foreign mercenaries and the depraved royal court that preyed on the common folk like a band of wolves on a flock of defenceless sheep. At least the villagers still had Rowena and her band of followers to fight the oppression of the false monarch, and she hoped eventually her style of fighting would be imitated by other valiant resistance fighters across the realm, in numbers that could not be ignored by the fearful rulers. Rowena was collecting her thoughts and trying her best to avoid thinking about Patrick's arms, and even Sir Rowland's muscular thighs, that never failed to bring her to the edge of sanity with his physical demands. No, this was not a time for flighty dalliances. It was a time for careful planning and cautious steps to ensure success in fighting the tyranny of the usurper's unjust rule. She was uncertain about the fate of good King Richard, the lawful ruler of the land. Her suspicion was that he would not return to take charge once again. There were too many enemies in these latter days after the violence of the Crusades. His reported incarceration for ransom was the final straw of indignities to his royal personage, and she feared it was not reversible with the deviousness and guile of the pretender King John's entourage and mercenary minions. Her heart wanted to believe he would come back to save his people, but her sceptical mind was far too logical to disregard the closing window of opportunity of that optimal outcome. Under the guise of returning to the convent for the purpose of making a novena for prayerful contemplation of the impossibility of paying the ransom and relying on King Richard's assumption of his royal duties, she took Patrick and Sir Rowland with her to the convent walls and asked them to take up residence outside, because the presence of 2 strapping males with virile instincts was far too compromising for the reputation of the good sisters. The Mother Superior knew that Lady Rowena was back to organise a consultation with forces much older than the beginnings of Christianity in the post-Roman lands of the realm. The counterpoint to the Druid concepts of human evolvement sometimes drove her to impulsive responses, but she wanted to gain guidance from the consensus of her fellow followers to determine the right path to take in this time of trouble. It was a lot quicker than she expected to come to the conclusion that King Richard's return was too risky to depend on, and that immediate action needed to be taken with regard to curtailing the activities of the usurper, King John and his mercenary evildoers sucking the lifeblood from the common folk and eliminating the well-intentioned barons of the kingdom. She exited the convent refreshed mentally and spiritually from her source of ancient learnings, ready to proclaim her new outlook the result of her Christian beliefs and the moral guidance of Holy Mother Church. Before they undertook the journey back to the deep reaches of the forest, she spent the night in the same room as the pair of male followers, and rewarded each of them with her feminine charms in a way that satisfied them equally well and caused no friction or jealousy, normally associated with male ideals of singular dominance. Rowland was smiling as they saddled the horses for the return trip. Young Patrick was still sleeping, as he was totally exhausted by Rowena's urgent needs sparked by her newfound enthusiasm to reverse the course of history and reclaim the land for the good of the people and not for the enrichment of a select group of royalty. They made fast time because the horses were well rested, and Rowena was anxious to start her new campaign of guerrilla warfare against the tacksmen of the district, and return the tax money to the common folk to help them live their lives in a way that spoke of freedom and liberty, and not a life of slavery under a master with little regard for their personal safety, or meeting the needs of their self-actualization above the limitations of mere survival. She rode the horse gingerly because her seat was much afflicted from the repeated pounding received from 2 inspired knights, with spunk to spare in a nocturnal setting. Their rare stops along the way were met with devoted offerings from the common folk of food and liquid refreshment, including the ale that Sir Rowland drank like water consumed by normal folk. He never seemed to be tipsy no matter how much he consumed, and she marvelled at the way his fighting skills appeared to improve when he was well lubricated with the strong brew of the homegrown variety. Rowena did her best to concentrate on her plans for intercepting the sheriff's collection wagon on its way to the castle of King John in only 3 days' time. They had a history of great success with such operations, but this time it would be out in open territory, away from the sheltering arms of the forest, and her spies had informed her that the guard was to be tripled for the arduous and filled with danger journey. In a way, she knew she had the advantage because the sheriff did not know when or where she would strike, and his men must follow limited routes to transfer the taxes to the vaults of the usurper King John. A messenger from the coast delivered a letter from her contact in the court of the French king, and informed them that there was doubt now that good King Richard had expired from his dreadful wounds sustained in prolonged battles in the Holy Land. She knew the convent that now sheltered his bones beneath their stone-covered crypts of saints and royalty, preserved for future generations to revere and worship in muted adoration. Her letter was addressed to her own mother superior, to be transferred under the seal of the church and away from the prying eyes of King John and his despised minions. It would be difficult to educate the common folk to the reality of King Richard's demise, but she knew that sooner was probably better than later to prevent further abuses by the greedy King John. Her contingent of archers now numbered almost 80, and she knew their accuracy was far superior to the mercenaries under the thumb of King John and his representative, the Sheriff of Nottingham. It was only that fact that convinced her that the risk of venturing away from the forest was called for in this single instance. The temptation of the multiple sacks of coins and jewellery inside the wagon was far too important to pass up because of a faint heart or weakened will to succour the common folk's oppression under the yoke of the robber king. They moved out of the forest in the dead of night. There were at least 100 of them in full count. She had asked the Knights Templar unit to operate at a distance from the main body as a reserve element to come to their rescue in the event of an unsuspected trap. In God's truth, Rowena didn't judge the sheriff's men to have the ingenuity or the fortitude to effect a trap worthy of merit. The archers were in good humour, and they shot plenty of rabbits to make a stew fit for a king. It was difficult to blend into the background with a troop movement of that magnitude. The people kept their distance not because they wanted to, but because they did not want to increase the chances of their movement to be discovered by the agents of King John. The day before the planned attack on the tax wagon, Rowena had her men in position and well hidden well before nightfall, and she sent scouts to check the road in both directions to make certain this was not a trap from which she could escape with absolute certainty. The only group of interest was a large movement of entertainers from the direction of King John's castle. The scout reported that they were headed to the next town to set up tents for a performance the following night. Apparently, they had a full troop of clowns and jugglers walking in the dust of the road, and with more than a dozen wagons filled with equipment for setting up a little city of performers to amuse the rural folk that seldom saw such a display. It seemed innocent enough, but Rowena was not comfortable with the fact that this was a force almost double her size, and it seemed a bit too convenient for them to be journeying at exactly the same time as her operation to seize the ill-gotten gains from the sheriff's men. She personally rode out to inspect the convoy, and found that it looked innocent enough to the naked eye. Still, her ingrained suspicions made her leave a pair of trusted scouts to shadow the convoy until it was well past her point of engagement with the sheriff's tax wagon. The trio of Knights Templars made their way almost to the shadows of King John's castle, but they didn't come into contact with any armed force, and they reported back to Rowena that all was quiet in that direction. All things considered, She had no reason to abort the operation based on the results of her careful screening of the site of the interception. It was the convoy of entertainers that sprung the trap on Rowena and her band of archers and swordsmen. They quickly eliminated her 2 scouts before they could return to report the subterfuge, and then armed themselves from the equipment wagons with all the tools of war. The clowns and jugglers quickly turned into mercenaries with murder and mayhem on their mind. The wagon was sitting low on its wheels, and Rowena was convinced it was due to the weight of the gold inside. However, it was actually an entire squad of crossbowmen in full armour that jumped to the ground the moment that Rowena and her archers accosted the driver. The quick, intense battle that followed resulted in the defeat of the unexpected hidden unit, but she lost almost a score of skilled archers to the deadly quarrels of the mercenaries. Somewhat shocked by the turn of events, she approached the wagon with her entourage of close followers, only to hear the shouts of her outriders reporting the appearance of dozens of mercenaries encircling the point of contact. Rowena signalled to her men that withdrawal was called for, and they disengaged as quickly as possible, moving rearward in the direction of the forest in orderly fashion, leapfrogging from position to position, and taking mercenary lives at every opportunity. Still, her force was reduced to less than half by the time they came in sight of the forest tree line, and the sound of a mounted unit fast approaching made her urge her men to full flight with no thought except the will to survive in the face of overwhelming odds. The trio of Knights Templar fighters fell on the rear of the mounted force, and they cut their way all the way up to the leaders, leaving death and destruction in their wake. They followed the remnants of Rowena's forces into the forest, and they all appeared to melt away into the shadows like ghosts of green leather and feathers from colourful plumes. The latest escapade of the forest dwellers that was focused on opposing the rule of the tyrant King John, and making a complete fool of the sheriff, caused dissension in the sheriff's castle, between the faction that fully supported the usurper king and the relatively few knights and ladies that still swore allegiance to the true King Richard. The confirmation of his death had not yet reached the court, and even the most steadfast supporters of his cause would soon return to their respective manors and become reclusive in order to survive in a land that no longer supported values of moral character or common decency. Many of those loyal barons would become victims of King John's deception and lose all of the lands and possessions, and in many cases, the lives of their entire families. Rowena had seen all of this chaos heading their way and had made an attempt to put her relatives and her farm workers in an isolated encampment away from the contrivances of the sheriff and his hired minions. His forces were often supplemented by the mercenaries of King John, whose command of the English language was pathetically lacking and added to their inability to identify with the common folk of the realm. She certainly didn't pity the burly muscle-bound knotheads with their macho ways and firm belief that females should be humped and not heard. Of course, they could have their way with the female segment of the other-than-royal population, but when they accosted a true lady of good name and standing, the rumours abounded about their disgusting mannerisms in disrespecting her dignity. When she heard of the Lady Elaine of Cornwall being made a feminine toy of a detachment of the mercenaries, she took a contingent of her archers and made haste to her castle to offer her services to right the wrong done to her dignity and honour. She found her old friend Elaine still in shock and sitting listlessly in her own self-pity for her shaming by the boisterous group of miscreants. She had already made her case known to the sheriff, and he had hemmed and hawed and eventually told her that there was not sufficient evidence to support her claim of complete innocence in the incident. This further pushed her into a semi-confused shell of remorse and guilt that ate at her conscience like rats in the basement, weakening the foundation of her mental stability. Rowena did her best to bring her back up out of the doldrums of her despair, but the damage done in the incident was compounded by the cavalier attitude of the sheriff's deputy that did his best to shift the blame to poor Lady Elaine in an attempt to give cover to King John's highly valued mercenary forces. She sensed it might be too late to bring Lady Elaine back from the precipice of loss of sanity, but she felt much better for having at least made the effort for her old friend. The acceleration of the goon squads of foreign tax collectors had taken place without the average citizen being fully aware of the subtle change in administration. Now it seemed like the changes were part of the country's fabric and would be difficult to shrug off to bring things back to the way they were before the ascension of King John to his pretender's chair. The tired knights returning from the Holy Land had their belly filled with violence, and they, to a man, desired only peace and quiet in a restful environment. The petty political infighting of royalty and government was not their cup of tea, and they did their best to stay away from the fray whenever possible. In the void of citizens' righteous indignation, and the absent without leave attitude of the barons and other combat-trained crusaders, the minions of King John oppressed the common people with increasing levels of taxation and social outrages. Rowena returned to the forest camp with mixed feelings. She knew she would be able to survive and even protect her people in the isolated spot. What bothered her was the fact that the oppression of the people was fast coming to a boiling point, and it would not be long before the pot would explode with bloody consequences and ruined lives. She made a visit to her familiar convent to receive some advice on the best course of action, and found that her work was well known by the Bishop of Canterbury, and that he was in the process of writing some formal words of a written contract between the monarchy and the common people that would withstand the sands of time and become a standard for proper governance for future generations. She was completely in accord with this grand scheme and prepared several items of contentious frictions that should be included in the overall document. The Mother Superior informed her that the unhappy barons had already decided to band together in opposition to the overreaches of the king, and that they considered it their duty and not disloyal in any way, since he had already broken the contract with the people by seizing the throne without endorsement. She made a long-delayed novena to pray for the salvation of the country, and was shriven of her sins by an elderly priest that was fortunately hard of hearing and did not comprehend the seriousness of her sinful lifestyle. She felt a bit guilty at taking advantage of his infirmity, but ascribed it to the will of God, and accepted her penance with a spirit of renewal and willingness to walk a new path in service to God's work and his divine plan for humanity. It was the youngest of the Knights Templar that came to the convent to inform her of the raid on her camp during her absence. She was shocked to hear that they had been forced to retreat to a higher elevation deeper in the woods, to dissuade the mercenaries of King John and the sheriff's minions from deadly violence on her followers. Apparently, her favourite archer, Patrick, was struck a mortal blow with several crossbow quarrels, and some foreign mercenary, in a berserk state of mind, swept his head from his body, with one blow from his accursed Viking axe, before he was allowed to expire in bloody defeat. Her people were saved by the courageous skills of the Knights Templar, and they guided her survivors to the high ground of a better defensive position. The pretender King's forces decided to accept the outcome as a victory, and returned to the safety of the sheriff's castle to celebrate their sneak attack on the forest dissenters. The nuns in the convent were fluttering about like a flock of birds put to flight by a hunting party of unknown origin. Rowena knew it was the presence of Sir Lawrence, the handsomest of the Knights Templar detachment in her camp. She had entertained a certain sense of obsession about his physical attributes, not unlike most of the nubile females in her forest-bound band of freedom fighters. Unfortunately, she correctly assessed his reluctance to engage in even the simplest of dalliances with the leader of the forest band, as due to his suspicion that she might be a witch with powers of enchantment. His dedicated adherence to the will of God precluded any relations with any female even remotely connected to the dealings with the devil, and he avoided her company whenever possible. She regretted his mistaken beliefs, but she was far too proud to reveal she was only interested in limited familiarities of instinctive behaviour, normally found in male and female relationships of a private nature. An explanation of that sort would confirm her need for soothing masculine manipulation, and make her standoffish external shell a parody of pretense. She decided it was far better to let him wallow in his mistaken beliefs, and hope that his sincere arousal would overcome his need for caution. To that end, she used a great deal of the French imported fragrances filched from the sheriff's shipments from abroad, and omitted her usual layered attire when conversing with him in the privacy of her tiny cell at the top of the tower. She was certain her fineness of female curvature would inspire some sort of reaction in the Knights Templar, but he insisted on ignoring her every attempt to rouse his manly spirit. It was extremely frustrating to her, but she simply put it down to the will of God and made do with pulse-pounding experiments of touching his muscular shoulders and arms with her delicate hands in friendly conversation. It was enough for her to achieve her basic needs, and he was none the wiser for his unwitting assistance in her deceit. They were away from the convent with the first light of day, and made excellent time to the forest's edge. She followed Sir Lawrence closely because he was seated on a swift steed, and seldom gave her any warning of an unexpected turn or change of direction. She knew he was skirting the bog that swallowed up the innocent and guilty without any judgment on their conduct in life. The bog was a hider of secrets, and she feared the almost mystical depths of the deceiving surface underfoot. The horses were in complete agreement with their caution, because they instinctively knew the danger of a single misstep. The new location for the camp was difficult to find, and that was a good thing from Rowena's point of view. If it was difficult for them, it must be difficult for the sheriff's men, and that was the thing that might save them in any future raid on their hideaway. She noticed right away that several of her followers were sporting bandages and splints for damage suffered in the recent assault. They were glad to see her back in their midst, but she sensed they were willed with a sense of righteous fortitude to persevere in her absence, and it was rewarding to her desire to have her followers ready to take care of their own needs, when self-preservation was of paramount importance. Sir Lawrence was kind enough to assist her in setting up her new tent for command purposes, and he even offered to act as her bodyguard to give her some insulation from the trickery of the desperate sheriff and his entourage of criminal perverts. She accepted mainly because it would mean he would be close to her in a nocturnal setting, and she was optimistic about his eventual conversion to a closer-than-just-friends relationship. The losses in the recent raid were not too severe, but she was depressed over the loss of her favourite archer, Patrick. The fact that he was more to her than just a skilled follower and able warrior weighted on her conscience. But she mollified her guilt with the fact that she had already been shriven for her weakness of the flesh, and was ready to move on to either a replacement or to live in celibate joy.